A very good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. We have apologies this morning from Rona Mackay, MSP. Ash Regan, MSP, is joining us online, and I also welcome Rachel Hamilton, MSP, to the meeting. So our first item of business today is to continue scrutiny of the Prostitution Offences and Support Scotland Bill. And we'll have one panel of witnesses today, and I intend to allow up to 75 minutes for this panel. And I refer members to papers 1 and 2. So, can I welcome to this morning's meeting Dr Emma Forbes, National Lead for Domestic Abuse and Head of Victims and Witnesses Policy at Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service; Liliana Torres Jimenez, Secretary of the Criminal Law Committee at the Law Society of Scotland; and Detective Superintendent Stephen Bertram from Police Scotland. So warm welcome to you all, and thank you to those of you who were able to provide a written submission. So just before we start, as ever, a plea to everyone to keep questions as succinct as possible and responses as well. So I wonder if I can maybe just ask a very broad question just to set the scene, and I'll maybe come to Dr Forbes first of all, and then I'll work along the panel. So can I ask what your views are overall of the bill? Is there anything in the bill which you particularly agree with or disagree with, or which you think could be improved? So I'll come to Dr Forbes first of all.
Good morning. Thank you, Convener. Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service supports the proposal within the bill to criminalise the buying of sex off street within private dwellings. And I know that you've received many consultation responses with a range of views, and must consider individual choice and the fact that there are some voices within that calling for that. But it was just to say that as prosecutors, we act in the public interest, and as part of that public interest test, we would take into account the views and interests of a victim of any offence. But as prosecutors, we recognise any exploitation or abuse of women and girls, and this is a gendered offence. Our statistics and crime stats show that. Any exploitation or abuse of women and children, our starting point as prosecutors is to presume that prosecution of that is in the public interest because of the wider societal harms and the wider harms on them as individuals. We know that many victims of that many women involved in prostitution are victims of myriad other offending and experience abuse, but also vulnerabilities. So we are proud to be part of the government's Equally Safe strategic board. We are active participants in that, and we support the policy intention behind this bill. I don't want there to be a but there are evidential difficulties in improving this offence. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, and it doesn't mean that they're insurmountable, but I think it's important that it's recorded that any intimate offending behind closed doors in private is always going to be more difficult to prove.
Thanks very much. Thank you for that. Liliana.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to all the members of the panel. The Law Society position regarding the bill, and in particular the policy intentions behind it, is neutral. Our comments were focused on some of the legal implications that we envisage from the proposals, and I think I will highlight 3 of them. First, the one related with the definition of performances of sexual act as part of the definition of the new offence proposed in the bill. We consider that further clarification should be provided on what it's understood by this new concept, or this concept in the terms of the bill. The second point that I want to highlight is regarding the penalty proposed and how those are consistent with the current sentencing provisions and practice. And the third point that I want to mention is maybe the debate between the statutory pardon and quashing historic convictions. I know that this committee heard some evidence before on which of both paths will be better for the policy intentions behind the bill, but we have some concerns on the proposed of quashing historic conviction as proposed in the bill. I'm happy to expand on any of those points or any further questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Detective Superintendent Bertram, over to you.
Morning, Convener. Morning, everyone, and thanks for having us along today. In a very probably similar position, Police Scotland were supportive in terms of the bill criminalising the purchase of sex, and I think for us, we recognise, and I'll probably speak about a lot today about consistency, and a lot of the challenge that we have is bringing that national, consistent and effective approach to policing in terms of all aspects of criminal sexual exploitation. We obviously work under the Equally Safe strategy, part of that, and we've worked really hard over the last couple of years looking at the current Scottish Government strategy and challenging men's demand. For us, coming back to consistency, where it's already illegal to buy sex in some circumstances, we look at on-street, and we have that gap currently in terms of the legislation not there in terms of off-street and behind doors, and then separate legislation that tackles human trafficking and exploitation. There is that, for me, that missing gap in the middle there. And that's the reason we remain supportive, and I think it gives a very consistent message to what we're trying to achieve and how we police that. I guess it's understanding that of when the crime would be complete, and I think it needs to make whatever comes in terms of legislation needs to be effective for policing. I know we'll probably get discussed. I think it's probably been discussed in previous hearings about what our colleagues in the rest of the UK and Ireland have done. I've certainly linked in personally with my opposite numbers in those areas, and I know the challenges they're faced with, and that would be my only reservation, is looking at whatever comes into Scotland needs to be effective and allows us to police effectively. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's a lot that we're quite keen to cover this morning that has been raised in previous sessions. I think one of the key ones is the issues around the application of the proposed new criminalising offence, so to speak, in the context of sort of off-street crime, off-street prostitution. I wonder, though, if I can maybe come back to Detective Superintendent Bertram, and one of the provisions in the bill relates to placing a sort of responsibility or a duty on ministers to ensure that support is provided to women who are working in this industry. And I know we know that Police Scotland is already heavily involved in collaborative work, extensive collaborative work within Operation Begonia, and as a North East MSP, I'm very aware of how well established and strong those collaborative partnerships are. So I'm interested in just your reflections and your commentary on how important that support, that non-criminalising element to the work around tackling prostitution and the demand for prostitution, how important that support element is, and what, if any, or how could that be improved, and where are there perhaps gaps in that provision that relate to the bill that would be helpful for us to understand?
No, thanks, Convener. So partnership working and support is it's hand in hand, and I think one without the other, I don't think it's going to we'd see success there. And I think that any work that we've planned on doing has always been with making sure that we've got key support in place. Sometimes it can be a bit of a postcode lottery with services available in some parts of the country, maybe not to the same standard in other parts of the country, and I think that is something that needs to be looked at and addressed to make sure, again, from the support side, that there is a consistency there. When we looked at Operation Begonia and Operation Waterdale, there were the two national operations running to target the areas where we had an on-street prostitution footprint. And across Scotland, then we've got Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee, Aberdeen, which were the 4 areas that we were aware of where that existed. And in each of those areas now, I think there's really good links in locally and nationally between the national side as well, looking at that. When we looked at Operation Waterdale, that was the operation that ran in Glasgow, they had more of a sort of intensification period. They worked hand in hand with the Route South service through in Glasgow, and that was going to be key. It was absolutely key to doing that, and I think that played a huge part in actually trying to judge, did we make any difference in that space? And that's the important part, as well, to step back and reflect on that. The work that happened in Glasgow, I think over the sort of 4 or 5 months at the end of last year, start of this year, for me, I thought we've seen a bit of a breakthrough in terms of challenging men's demand, looking at support and actually trying to give that best opportunity for anyone selling sex, mostly women in that area, in fact all women in that area, to exit safely. Some of the challenges that policing faces to the CSE side is one part of many crimes and the violence against women and girls space that we try and look at. It's constantly juggling, prioritising that demand and looking at risk. But if it was a longer term approach to there, I think it would be really, really effective. And then, I'm sorry I can be a bit of a talker as well, apologies, but
could I just come in perhaps just a very final wee quick question with regard to sustaining support and specifically funding. I'm interested in what the current picture is across Scotland with regard to supporting. So I know, for example, in the North East, fairer funding is what is used to support the work to support women. I suppose I'm interested in how reliable and how sustainable funding will be, given what we're looking at today in the context of the bill and specifically the provision around support.
No, absolutely, and I think so. Aberdeen's the only area just now that gets that external funding. Everywhere else is looked at, looking to use what we've got with the existing police budget and prioritising that resource into that area to do that. We have engaged a few times now with Scottish Government and obtained additional grants, which we've used for overtime. So that's a lot of times where we struggle to resource within the normal working day, is have that overtime in place to stand up patrols. And I should have some of those numbers that we can look at how many patrols took place. I'd have to maybe come back after this in terms of the costing of that, though. Yeah.
Well, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much. OK, I'm going to open up to members and I'll bring in Liam Kerr and then Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I will come for my first question to Liliana Torres Jimenez and remind colleagues that I am a current member and am regulated by the Law Society of Scotland. Liliana, you talked in your submission about, and in your opening remarks, about your concerns about the definition of sexual acts and the proposed penalties. Could you expand on your concerns here? Also tell us what you think needs to be amended to address those concerns. And since you mentioned it in your submission, you brought up the policy memorandum in that, and which specifically says this bill aims to reduce the amount of prostitution in Scotland. As drafted and/or amended, will that be achieved by this bill?
Well, to begin with the last question, we don't know. I think that that's something for the Parliament to evaluate the policy intention of the bill and consider if that can be achieved or not. So I don't have an answer to that question. However, I can expand on the other two questions that you made before. To start with, the definition concern that we have mainly is focused on the definition of performance of sexual act, because you may see that Section 9(1) of the bill provides a definition of the performance of sexual act for the terms of Section 1, which contain the offence of paying for the performance of sexual act by a person. Subsection 1A of Section 9 indicates that the performance of sexual act will be an act intended to cause sexual arousal, gratification, or stimulation of any person. However, subsection 1B have some exclusions. In particular, striptease, pole dancing, lap dancing, and says other erotic performances. Our concern is that it's not very clear what is understood by other erotic performances, and this is crucial because this is an exclusion from the definition. So we consider that when drafting any offense, that should be as clear as possible to everyone to understand what is prohibited and what is not. And we can envisage some problems in drawing the line, whereas an erotic performance and where the behavior will be under the limits of the section of the subsection 1A. So we will recommend either providing like a specific exclusion as it was provided for striptease, pole dancing, and lap dancing, or to define other erotic performances. Regarding your second question on penalties, we highlighted in our written submission that the penalties proposed in the bill are, and in particular the imprisonment penalties proposed in the bill, are for summary proceedings not exceeding 6 months, and on conviction on indictment not exceeding 12 months. We noticed that the maximum penalties proposed in the bill, which is 12 months, can be achieved by summary proceedings. So we are not clear why the offence will be triable in both type of proceedings. We notice as well that this concern was also highlighted by the Scottish Sentencing Council in their written submission. So I think we will welcome some clarification on why that was the case for the offence as drafted. And the second concern that we raised regarding sentencing was how they match with how those sentences match with the give me 1 second, I will refer to my note. With the presumption against short sentences, which we understand that Section 204 or 3A of the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act of 1995 prevents court for imposing sentences of imprisonment for a term of 12 months or less. I heard the oral evidence of Ms. Regan, and she says that according to that provision, she envisaged that not many of the offenders will go into jail and other type of sentences will be imposed to them. But this is a legitimate question, if the imprisonment penalty is not thought to be imposed, why is in the bill then? I imagine that is because for very serious cases that involve probably other type of offences, but I also consider that if there are further criminality in there are other mechanisms in the existing legislation that can address those type of criminality. So that will be our concern.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Dr. Forbes, you say in your submission that the Crown Office is concerned that police and prosecutors in Scotland will face similar evidential barriers to Northern Ireland and Ireland to enforcing the proposed new offence. And this was something you raised in your opening remarks as well. You talked about evidential issues. Can you expand on what you mean by that, and how would the Crown Office envisage prosecuting the offences set out in the bill?
Okay, so I think we have to start by remembering that the United Nations has recognised the sexual exploitation of women as a human rights violation. So our starting point would be to presume that prosecution of an offence such as the one drafted in the bill would be in the public interest. But we can only prosecute where we have sufficient evidence. And I know from hearing Ms Regan's submissions and from reading the policy memorandum that she was hopeful that we would be able to prosecute without the evidence of the women who were involved in prostitution. And I have to say that as a prosecutor, I struggle to see how we could do that consistently. There may be occasions where that might be possible, but I think that we would have to manage the committee's expectations to say that the reality is that their evidence would be important. The other important thing to say about their evidence, and I know that there are huge barriers to securing their evidence safely, the only way that we have any realistic hope of securing those women's evidence safely is if the support that's provided for in the bill is fully resourced and available, because everything we know about the prosecution of intimate offending, about violence against women and girls, which is a strategic objective for the Crown, and we're really committed to it and we've worked hard across a lot of areas, but everything we know about the prosecution of sexual violence, domestic abuse, honour-based violence is that without proper support to women, we won't secure that evidence. So the support is critical. It's much wider than just the nuts and bolts of what, as a prosecutor, I might need to prove a case. It's also about supporting them and enabling them to safely give evidence.
And you successfully preempted where I was going with that question about the contradiction between what Ash Regan told this committee on the 25th of June about not necessarily needing women's evidence and your own suggestions in your opening submissions. But you did reference specifically the Northern Irish and the Irish situation. Is this the only evidential challenge that they've faced, whether people in prostitution need it to give evidence or not? Or have you seen other evidential challenges that cause you concern?
So like Detective Superintendent Bertram, I've had the opportunity to discuss this with Irish colleagues, and I'm not qualified in Ireland, but would say my understanding of their legislation is that they don't have that it's a narrower definition. So in terms of... So firstly, I think their police powers are different, but I'm not qualified to answer on that question. But I think that might make a material difference. I don't think that I don't think that they have the same common law powers that Police Scotland do. But I would want that to be clarified by somebody who actually was an expert in policing. But also just to say that I don't think that the legislation in Ireland if you just give me a moment. Has a reasonable inference test. And yeah, so that will narrow the scope of what they're able to prove quite substantially. Mm-hmm. But then to go back to Liliana's point about the caveats in the bill, some of what is precluded from the definition might be what would allow police to infer a reasonable inference in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I am going to press you, just if you don't mind, Dr. Forbes, just simply because your submission specifically says that the Crown Office is mindful of the challenges in enforcing the legislation in Ireland, and the Crown Office is concerned that prosecutors in Scotland will face similar evidential barriers. So I'm just trying to understand, what are those evidential barriers that you may face that will be similar?
Okay, so there are perhaps differences in the law that may mean that Ireland face greater evidential barriers than us, but that doesn't detract from the fact that we are concerned that there are evidential barriers to proving these cases here. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that in principle the legislation isn't well founded. It just means that we have an obligation to say that these are difficult cases to prove. So it's intimate offending in private. It's the Women's Support Project have done some amazing research and work with women involved in prostitution in Scotland, and they know that 77% of those women have been the victim of serious violent offending and sexual abuse and domestic abuse. They're victims of other offences. They're fearful of talking to the police and telling them what's happened to them for a range of reasons. They may also be involved in substance misuse, facing homelessness. They may also have been convicted themselves for lower level offending. I know that even some parts of that have been, the bill seeks to address some of that, but there will be other reasons why they may have come into conflict with the law because of the nature of their lifestyle and the limited choices and sphere of agency that these women have. So because of that, there will be a lot of perceived barriers by them, I would imagine, to talking to law enforcement about what's happened to them.
Very
and that's a reality.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sharon Dowie and then Katie Clark.
Good morning, thank you. If I could start with Detective Superintendent Bartram. Could I ask, how would Police Scotland envisage policing the offence set out in the bill?
So there's a few questions here just in terms of, there's an important one for me is when is the crime complete? And this is where, some of the issues come in trying to identify criminality in Ireland. So when we make comparisons to On Street, where we don't use the evidence of any of the women, it's, the observations of the police. And I think that's a really important one, and it's trying to, and it's something, I guess, for ourselves and Dr Forbes and Copfus to look at that in a bit more detail about a case-by-case basis of threshold in those matters, because every case is going to be different in slightly different circumstances. However, in the on-street space, where we have the observations of police officers seeing somebody quite clearly in that area to buy sex, then the threshold in that point is met, and that's where the offenders will be charged, they'll be stopped and charged. Off-street's more difficult because sometimes behind closed doors we won't always see at what door, if it's a block of flats, what door somebody's going into, what area, are they new to that area, do they have links to any other part of the building. However, there is other cases where the police will be in attendance to a potential, an address which has been reported by a member of the public that says, I suspect that a brothel is operating from, an address somewhere in Scotland. And the police will be attending there to make inquiries, check safety, and whilst they're there, they might be faced with that situation of we have two women, one, whatever in this house, and a guy that's here. There's no link to the address, and I think that's the part we probably need to explore in a bit of detail of taking mobile phones is going to be when we're looking at other offending, when we look at the the abuse of children, mobile phones. The work that those teams do in terms of the downloads of the phone, the abstraction of that phone are probably stretched beyond capacity. I think to put them under further capacity in terms of doing this with the scale we're looking at, I think will be problematic and be challenging. And I think it's trying to find the model that looks of where are we satisfied that the crime is complete in terms of the purchase of sex. Is it because in some circumstances we've found them in an area or within a house or within an area where we know sex is being sold, and they're in certain circumstances which would infer that they're either been in that act shortly before the police came or thereafter, and is that the threshold? And I think that's probably parts that we really need to thrash out in terms of individual case studies of yes, met, absolutely not met, and what we'd have to do a bit further.
So the way the bill is just now, with the issues that police currently have in trying to arrest somebody or prosecute, are we able to work with the bill, or do we need something totally different? Can we make amendments to the bill as it is that will help the police in being able to actually arrest and charge people that are causing harm to women and girls?
Possibly. I mean, I think when we look at the scale, so we've done the Scoping exercise. Last year there was just under 1 million adverts in Scotland advertising sex. So I think it was 962,000 was the kind of ballpark number. We will struggle to police 962,000 adverts. Almost on a daily basis, somebody phones Police Scotland to report a potential brothel for lots of different reasons, whether that's a concern for people in the house, if there's concerns about the women in the house or concerns that there's a number of guys coming into a particular area. So even trying to police that demand will be a challenge. And if we were looking at surveillance, and then that would be very resource intensive given the numbers that's involved. And I think that's where we probably need to look at the policing approach in terms of that. Are we looking at the inferences because somebody, if police, say for instance, take away the 962,000 adverts and almost like that almost daily occurrence of police being called to an address to do a safe and well check and investigate circumstances there. I don't have the exact figures, but I don't know how many guys we would encounter in those calls, but could they essentially be dealt with? And that would be the kind of starting point without the surveillance, and which I think would be extremely resource intensive.
No, okay, just one question, just to explain it a bit to me, is in the submission it says that Police Scotland recognise that we've got sound legislation in place to be able to deal with the challenge and demand for on-street prostitution. It says we've got appropriate legislation where trafficking is apparent. So we need to strengthen off-street. But in question 2, we've also got where it says that we're going to repeal section 46 of the Civic Government Act. It says Police Scotland are fully supportive. So everybody always talks about tools in their toolbox. Will that then not cause issues for you? If we repeal that, would that cause issues? About
criminalising the seller? So we're not really doing that at all. If that's not the model we're operating on just now. So I don't think that's going to be impactful on us.
So you're fine with that, right? And one last question to all three would be for the financial memorandum. Are you able to estimate the scale of any costs for your organisations arising from the bill, and are these adequately represented in the bill's financial memorandum? And if I could possibly start off with Dr Emma Forbes on that one, because you've said that COPS was not consulted in advance for the preparation of the financial memorandum. So could I ask for your comments?
So I think the member bringing the bill did make efforts to seek that information in advance, and there was a breakdown in communication and it went to the wrong place. So I just want to clarify that it wasn't done in fairness to the preparation of the bill. But also just to say that I think at this stage, when there are questions, for example, over forum and how the cases would be prosecuted and what's going to be within scope, it's very difficult to narrow that down and make an estimate at the moment. We would anticipate with new criminal legislation that it would be absorbed, but I think that it would very much depend on how the bill looks at the end. And I'm sorry, but it's difficult today to give a definitive on the cost. If it helps in relation to the final question that you asked Detective Superintendent Bertram about the repeal, Police Scotland reported 46 charges to us between the 1st of April 2020 and August of this year. That was 46 charges across 10 cases, and we've prosecuted 2, and those were at solemn level offending because there were other charges. So if that gives you a scale of the fact that it's not... There's a principled approach by the police and the Crown not to criminalise the seller.
Okay, that's fine,
Yeah,
thanks.
thank
Liliana?
We don't have any comments regarding. Yeah.
Superintendent Bertram?
No, thank you. I think the costings that our legislative team, the impact of that, they looked at 2 specific costs. One was in relation to the actual physical change and update to the crime management system of adding an additional charge or offence in there. And the other part was really around the training package, the build, and then the training of taking officers off that front line to look at the package and self-train essentially. So I think that figure was it's around in total was £636,700. It didn't look at the operational kind of side of that. Now, I don't have those figures in front of me, but I could certainly get those pulled together out with this. But again, it's back to going on the approach, so right now, if somebody phones the police and says, I suspect a brothel's opera in there, those police officers are going to go to that, and they're going to do work there. They're not just going to walk away. You know, they're going to, even though the legislation's not there, if they've got somebody in that house, there's going to be a lot of work done, mainly around support. If we were looking at a different set of circumstances of standing up, you know, with a whole investigation around every single one, then we'd have to cost that in terms of how many officers are going to be involved in that. So it's quite tricky to try and cost out that side, if that makes sense. But I think what they absolutely bolt on is that number of 636 is for a change of a crime management system and a training package to adopt the legislation. What it won't look at is that, what impact that's going to have on policing.
If there's any other figures that you could send us, that would be helpful. But as it stands just now, the figures that are in the financial memorandum, do you think that they will rise?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Katie Clark and then Jeannie Hepburn.
Thank you. And Emma Forbes referred to, I think, 46 prosecutions. Is that correct? Could you perhaps clarify exactly what that number refers to?
Charges.
Charges.
So charges from the police.
And what was the nature of the charge?
Sorry, and that was for contraventions of Section 46 of the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that clarification, because I was going to ask you about that legislation, because obviously this bill provides for the repeal of the offences set out in the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982, which criminalises street prostitution. So you've given us an indication of the numbers of charges that have been brought. Could you maybe say a little bit more about the use of that offence in recent years and whether you support its repeal?
So the last time this committee looked at this offence, I think, was prior to the human trafficking legislation coming into force. And the policy memorandum and the evidence that was placed before this committee at that time said that in Scotland we were prosecuting more women for prostitution than men. So we can see that there has been a real societal, cultural, police and prosecution, that justice shift over that period of time. So within a decade, that's quite a significant shift, because now I'm looking and can see that we've prosecuted 2 women since, well, the start of lockdown in 2020, effectively. And that was only, and both of, I don't know the details of those cases, but I can see that they were prosecuted at solemn level, which means that there were other charges to warrant that being on indictment. So that means that these were cases where there was significant other offending to justify the prosecution, and that we haven't prosecuted anybody for any women for selling sex as a standalone offence in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. And do you support the repeal of that legislation?
As prosecutors, we recognise our United Nations Convention obligations. We see violence against women and girls as a human rights violation, and would support the repeal of that section of the
Thank
bill.
you. That's helpful. I don't know if any of the other witnesses have a view on that, in terms of whether the offences in the 1982 Act should be repealed. Maybe you don't have a view, but I don't know if Stephen would like to come in on that.
I mean, certainly for us, you know, the activity that we're doing just now through Begonia and Waterdale, that our focus is on absolutely the buyers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm aware that there's been, I generally think, a couple of arrests which we have responded to the following day. We've become aware of those and engaged, saying that that wasn't the focus of last night. And that comes down to sometimes a lack of training, but it doesn't match what the messaging is, what we're trying to achieve on that. So we are kind of very focused that we understand that there's a lot of be vulnerabilities there, and that's not the focus of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. That's helpful. And the bill also seeks to quash existing convictions for the offence. And I know that Emma Forbes had concerns in relation to that, but one of the alternatives that's been suggested is that there should be a pardoning in relation to people who have been convicted. And I wondered what your views were either on the quashing of existing convictions or the alternative of a pardon. And I'll come to Dr Forbes to start with, given that she's already expressed some view.
I don't think it was me who expressed the view.
Oh,
I think-
apologies. Or
sorry.
maybe it was Liliana. Sorry, apologies.
No,
Apologies,
it's fine.
apologies for that.
I'm happy to respond that.
Yes.
We will prefer the statutory pardon because that's consistent with other acts that had a similar intention than the one that we can see in the bill, and in particular the historical sexual offences pardon and disregard Scotland Act of 2018. We understand that there has been 2 cases in which the Parliament provided a statutory pardon, which the first one was this one, and the second one was the Minors' Strike Pardon, Scotland Act of 2022. However, after reading the policy memorandum of the latest one, I don't think it is the same situation or similar situation as the one that we are studying today. I think it's more similar to the historical sexual offences pardon and disregard. And basically what happened in that legislation was that the Parliament took a dual approach, first providing a statutory pardon that had a symbolic effect on those that were convicted on some sexual offences, in particular same sexual activity between men. And the bill also provided a scheme for people convicted of those sexual historical offences to apply for a conviction disregarded, in order to maybe diminish any negative impact that those convictions may have in their life after they were convicted. We saw that the bill proposes squashing convictions as the Post Office Horizon System offences Scotland Act of last year. And we don't think that will be the appropriate way to address the problem raised in the policy memorandum, because we think it's not a matter for the Parliament to quash convictions that were saved in principle and made by the Scottish Court. What happened in the Post Office Act was that there were compelling evidence that challenged the evidence that was used to convict those postmasters in the time that the offences were prosecuted. Accordingly, it was needed a redress scheme to allow those people that were wrongly convicted to access to compensation. But we understand that that's not what it's proposed in the bill. What it's proposed in the bill is to remove any record for those that were convicted under Section 46 of the Civic Government Scotland Act of 1982 in order to provide better services and allow those women involved in prostitution to make other activities that allow them to exit to prostitution. So to summarize, we don't think that quashing conviction will be the path as it will have an implication in the rule of law and in the principle of separation of powers, and in particular giving the possibility to the Scottish Parliament to quash safe convictions. We understand that happened in the past in a very exceptional circumstance with the Post Office case, but we don't think the circumstance is the same here, because we are not discussing the conviction itself. We are discussing the fairness of the consequence of a safe conviction.
Mm-hmm. So I understand the distinctions you're making. Are there any other reasons why you feel it would be wrong to quash existing convictions? Because I've heard other reasons given, and I'm just wanting to be absolutely clear whether that is the reason that the Law Society of Scotland takes the position it's taking, or whether they've got any other concerns. Is it more that if they believe that if the evidence was there at the time, it was an offence at the time, then therefore it would be inappropriate to quash that, but it's appropriate to pardon? I fully understand that the point you're making, but is there any other reason that from the Law Society of Scotland's point of view, or have you articulated the position?
I think that's the main reason, but when I was preparing this oral evidence session, I also saw that this discussion was also made in the historic offences bill. And one of the reasons that were provided in that time for going to the statutory pardon route was that it can be seen that was unnecessary to make a proactive record search that I understand is what it's proposed in order to diminish the negative impact and in particular the re-traumatization that women involved in prostitution may experiment if they are, for example, identified, if they receive a communication saying, for example, that they need to apply for a scheme in order to disregard the conviction. I understand that, but in that time in which the policy issue was similar, the reason that were provided that were two of them. First, that many of those men that were convicted in that time were passed away, and it will be a waste of resources to reach them if the conviction, if they don't want, sorry, if they had to pass away. And the second one that I think it's more relevant is that many of them, even when they receive the convictions, they don't want to know anything about the disregard of any conviction because they have made their own life, they have passed through this episode of their lives, and they don't want to be involved in maybe contacting them for saying them, you don't need to do anything, but your conviction has been disregarded, could be also re-traumatize them. So I think something similar, or we can learn from that experience within the current bill, and it will provide the choice for the woman to apply to any potential scheme. It doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be for the government to identify the woman and go and provide them the communication that they need to apply. Now there are technological tools that could address the problem of identification better. So
we're straying from the central issue about whether it's pardon or quashing, but I understand the point you're making, so I'm grateful for that. Have any of the other witnesses on this particular issue of either quashing the conviction or a pardon, is there any points you think that the committee should be aware of? Emma Forbes.
I don't really have anything to add, thank you.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that. And there are currently a range of offences dealing with issues such as human trafficking and the running of brothels, which the bill doesn't seek to change. Do you think there's a need to strengthen or otherwise reform other offences relevant to prostitution? I don't know if any of the witnesses have a view on that.
No, thank you, Kavina. I mean, personally, for me, I think that the human trafficking legislation is good. I think we use it effectively. I think it's still there's still work to do for cases in that benchmarking side, but I don't think there's many things in that legislation we'd probably change in terms of that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie Hepburn, then Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. A lot of the ground I'd hoped to touch on has already been covered, but just focusing on repeal of Section 46, it was instructive to hear from Detective Superintendent Bertram that effectively, I think I may be paraphrasing you, but you said you're not really operating that at this moment in time, and certainly the figures that Dr Forbes has provided would seem to substantiate that. Just to drill into that a little further, so there was 46 charges against 10 cases, by 10 cases, 10 individuals. Is that what that means? In the period,
yes, unless there was more than
to August. If you don't have it just now, that's okay.
Yeah, so I think there was probably multiple charges against one person, but I would need to check that. What I did check was I was interested in the gender breakdown, so I did check. So it was 10 individuals reported, and in 10 cases, and all of the individuals were women.
Okay. And the fundamental point, there was 2 prosecutions, and what you said is that would likely be on the basis of there were other charges associated with that. So I suppose the question would be... So
that there must have been, because they were on indictment, yes.
So, and this might be a difficult question to answer, so tell me if it is, but in the circumstances that that section of the 1982 Act didn't exist, would those prosecutions still likely have proceeded? There would have been enough charges and whatever the
I don't think I can answer a hypothetical.
So, okay, no, that's fair. I recognise it might not have been a question that could be answered. And I know, I also understand we don't want to stray too much into individual cases, but if there is more information that could be provided around the sort of context of that, it would be useful to understand. Also, again, I'm not suggesting you'll have this information just now, but the historic comparison would also be useful, I think, and instructive. Clearly, this has been the basis that it's been operated for the last 5 years at least, if not longer. But what was the experience over a longer period of time? I presume there were far more instances of prosecutions. That'd be my presumption. But if we could have the evidence to set that out, it'd be useful to understand, I think.
Certainly, I think there was evidence just prior to the human trafficking legislation that I looked at, so I think that would be quite easy to provide to the committee. I can do that.
I suppose the question,
quite a stark picture of a change, certainly.
I think that'd be useful for us to understand. I suppose the obvious question might be, though, if you could look at it at one of two ways. If we're operating on this basis just now, then the question might be, well, what would be the purpose of repealing this section? Maybe that gets to the heart of Sharon Dowie's question. Is there still purpose? Is still some utility in having this as part of the I'm trying to think of the term, armoury that would be available for investigation, or is the point that, well, if it's not being used, then why keep it in the statute book? What's the fundamental perspective there?
As long as it's still in the statute book, it still can competently be used, and there are occasions when it is used. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the declaratory power of the law, and the fact that at the moment the message is that if there are acts of prosecution going on behind closed doors, then by the law defines women as criminal and men not. And I think in terms of our UN obligations and in terms of our equally safe commitment across all justice partners and the landscape that we operate within in Scotland, as working closely as multi-agency relationships to strengthen our response to violence against women and girls, that is an unfortunate message.
Okay. I don't know if others have a perspective on.
I think it's probably just a change in times, from when to where we've a better understanding now. I'm exactly what Dr. Forbes said. I think, they're recognising it. We recognise as violence against women and girls. We're probably, going back, I don't know how long actually, but they probably didn't have the same clarity, the same understanding of that. So whilst it's still there, we do look at, the Lord Advocate's, guidance on that matter. It gives the police discretion. It's not as if we're turning a blind eye to not doing that, but it's coming under the discretion that's given to the police, recognising that there's a lot of vulnerabilities and violence that's in the background there.
Okay. We've had there have been differences of opinion on this in terms of the evidence we've taken thus far, but there are some people who strongly feel that if this law was introduced, there's a concern that it would drive activity underground with the consequential impact that it could make the environment less safe and more violent for those who are involved in the selling of sex. Now, that's a pretty concerning thing to hear. Now, except there are others who've made the point that we can never make this environment truly safe, which I understand, and there are others who say that the evidence would suggest it doesn't indicate an upturn in violent behaviour. But that's something that we've heard. Do you have a perspective on what the likely outcome would be?
I'd be quite happy to answer that one. So, there is already huge levels of violence that happens behind closed doors, and there's already huge levels of violence and sexual violence that exist there. So I don't think that's going to get pushed any further underground to where it is just now, to be honest. I think there's a very much underreported criminality from a lot of women that are selling sex for lots of different reasons. I'll go back to the point earlier on about the volume of calls that Police Scotland get. It's almost a daily basis that somebody's phoning the police about concerns about a suspected brothel. So I don't think we can ever push that underground, because the police will always... I think people understand exploitation a little better than what we did a long time ago. And I think people are more encouraged now to phone the police, depending on why they want to report that. I go back to those figures just under 1 million adverts in Scotland last year alone, and right across just about every community in Scotland. So I don't think we would push it any further underground to where we are just now. I think.
You would dismiss the notion that this could increase the risk of violence against those involved in selling sex? I mean, that's the fundamental question. Does it increase the likelihood?
It's really difficult to give it's going to be hypothetical, I guess, on that. What we can say is that we see really high levels of violence already. A lot of that's been unreported to the police, and it's only by the matter of looking elsewhere we find out that report actually comes out. So just because it's not been reported, does it make it there? I think it's almost opening the doors a bit of rebuilding that trust and confidence and saying that's our goal, is to have those reports coming in so we can actually target those really dangerous offenders that are out there.
There's clearly a perception of that risk, though. I mean, is that something that your officers will hear in engaging with those involved in the selling of sex? Will they have heard that if this is a change coming in, they'd be concerned about that?
I'd hope so. I think, you know, I think just through the educational piece of what we're trying to achieve in policing, you know, we've been very vocal in terms of what we're trying to do policing-wise.
So I think when you answered the hopes, so maybe that, I don't think that would have been your answer to the question I was asking. With respect, I was asking if your officers are hearing from those involved in selling sex if this was a change that was coming in.
No, we've not heard that.
Okay.
Not heard
Do others have a perspective in the likelihood of this making it a more dangerous environment? No perspective at all. Okay. I mean, it's okay if you don't. I'm just no. None?
If not, I'll maybe just move on because we are slightly tight for time and I've still got some members to come in. So if I may interject and just move you on to your next question.
Okay, certainly. Just one final question, and it's I think it's only Police Scotland that have responded to the question around the type of that there should be a statutory right for those involved in selling sex to access support services. So everyone is entitled to answer, of course, but particularly to you, Deputy Superintendent Bertram, you know, what should that look like? And we did hear some evidence that, you know, the Swedish experience was that there's not improved relationship between those selling sex and the police, but the Irish experience was different. It has improved the experience of interaction. So, again, how would it link to that as well?
I think it's really key. And I think we understand that if we work hand in hand with sort of key agencies, if that support was absolutely in place, that we also understand that not everybody wants to speak to the police. So it becomes that point of when do we withdraw, but happy that we've got a really good support in place then that builds that confidence and that they know that the door for the police is always open. So as probably I said earlier on, I think those work hand in hand. I think that needs to be in place first.
Do you know what should it look like? What sort of support should there be?
So I think, a snapshot across the country just now, there's areas across Scotland where we've got really good support in place just now, and probably looking at the existing work that's already ongoing. I also can probably make reference to, that I get the impression sometimes it can be a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of, is the same support else across the country? I don't think it is. I think we've seen those gaps. I think it'd be really good, and if you've got a really good operating model, say if it was in Glasgow and the support services there, then should that be replicated? It's the absolute right thing to have that replicated to across the country.
Okay, I don't know if there's a perspective from others in terms of what support should look like. No. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we're just coming up to about 15 minutes left, and I still have two committee members looking to come back in and one wanting to come back in with us follow-up questions. So I am going to have to ask for succinct questions and succinct responses if possible. So on that, I'll bring in Pauline McNeill, then Fulton McGregor.
Thank you. Good morning. Could I start to ask Dr Emma Forbes, who spoke to committee many times about violence against women and girls, and you've given us some excellent evidence, I have to say. I wanted to ask, so you're clear about what you said to the committee about harm to women, and of course the backdrop to this is, as you've told us many times, the rising trend in serious and violent crime against women and girls as the backdrop. I wondered if you thought that the harm to women would extend to women not involved in prostitution or the sale of sex. So if we talking about the evidence we've had about decriminalisation of sexual services, if we did that, I mean, do you think there'd be a wider harm to women and girls if it was legalised to sell sex, not just those women involved in prostitution?
So not talking about the charge of criminalising the buyer, but repealing.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of witnesses who've come to the committee and they've presented evidence that we should just decriminalise it for some of the reasons that Jamie Hepburn had the line of question about safety of women and others who believe in choice. And my question, if we did
so
that...
decriminalising altogether, so
yes.
not...
Yeah, we've had a lot of evidence that we just decriminalise it. And my concern would be if we did that, so there's harm to women involved in prostitution, which you've spoken about.
Yes,
but
and
is
not
there a
just
wider
in, not
harm
just
given
in the individuals. So it's not about the individual harm to individual women involved in prostitution, and that harm, and whether or not that is a harm. And that's not a question for me as a prosecutor. That's a sociological question.
Okay.
But what we know as prosecutors is that the women involved in prostitution are more likely than others to be the victim of other offending, to be the victim of serious violent offences and sexual violence and domestic abuse. We also know that those involved in buying sex, whether on street or off, wherever, are more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse, to be involved in other forms of violence against women and girls more broadly in our society in terms of treatment of other women. So I think that it, from a public interest point of view, needs to be seen through a wider lens.
Thank you very much. Could I ask Liliana, you've spoken about the sort of technicalities of the framing of the legislation. I wanted to ask you about your view on the issue of consent, which is a matter for sexual offences such as the crime of rape. Now, I did go to a private briefing that Ash Regan, or not a private briefing, but outside the committee, where there were women who'd been previously involved in the sex trade from different countries, Canada, Sweden, and they spoke to the difficulty in those countries, which I appreciate is a different law, in prosecuting crimes of rape and sexual offences that turns on the question of consent when the sale of sex is a legal matter and they use the word contractual matter. I just wondered if you saw any similar problems in Scotland for women who obviously face the same threats as any other women who are involved in the sex trade, who might be the victim of a crime, even although the act itself of selling sex is lawful.
But just to clarify, that will be in the scenario in which there is no prohibition of any prostitution activity, or as the law it is right now.
So so if this sale of sex was a lawful matter, would there be any difficulties in the issue of consent when it comes to sexual crimes, in your view?
I will need to come back on that, because I think that's a very deep question that maybe requires further investigation.
Yeah, I don't think it was a straightforward one. I only asked it because in the briefing that I heard, those women were saying in those countries it became very, very difficult in the context of the legalisation of the sale of sex to then prove in the court of criminal law. It would be helpful if you did have any views on that. Could I ask Superintendent Stephen Bertram about where the sale of sex happens in brothels? I had a look at Germany, for example. So there's an estimated 1.2 million men in Germany buy sex every day, and sex work was legalised in 2002. But we've heard some evidence that legalising it or decriminalising it doesn't really affect that. You're not going to see a proliferation of brothels. But Germany would suggest otherwise. I just wondered if you had a view. My line of question, obviously, you've heard us about, because we've heard evidence about decriminalising it, and I'd just be interested in your view in that. Would it lead to more brothels, for example?
It's a tough one. I think in terms of the sort of the decriminalisation side, I think the police are still needed to be that barrier. Is my own views, and I think, and I base that on some of the operational work we've done, and I go back to Operation Waterdale in Glasgow. We've done that prolonged initiative of criminalising the buyer on street. Now, what was quite a worrying trend was a lot of the guys that we were interacting with had really bad criminal history in terms of violence against women, both in a domestic setting and out with that domestic setting, and a lot of really serious offending in terms of sexual crime. So in terms of that individual, those guys, actually we wouldn't want them to come into contact with any woman. And we certainly wouldn't want them to come into contact with any woman selling sex where there's a particular vulnerability. So decriminalising that side makes it difficult for the police to then engage with those guys and saying, I personally think that the work that the team's done in Glasgow prevented a lot of offending, a lot of violence. So would we? I don't know the answer in terms of would we see more brothels? I would imagine so, because people are going to make money, and I think with the scale we see just now, and moving away from the kind of off streets and looking at a human trafficking side, where my teams will actively investigate human trafficking investigations where there's organised crime. So we see exploitation at the highest level in plain sight, and lots of money being made just now. So if you decriminalised that side of it, then I would have a fear that people would capitalise on that right away and say, well, there's money to be made here, let's move in. And when there's no threshold for the police to investigate criminality on the purchase of that, then does it give us, the police, a fighting chance to be able to target sort of dangerous offenders?
Thank you. Just for completeness, I don't know if Dr Emma Forbes, you wanted to contribute anything to my question to Liliana about the question of consent as a prosecutor.
Only to say that we're keen to learn more on issues of consent for women involved in selling sex, and we have been working with the Women's Support Project and have training lined up that it will be workshop model where, so the Women's Support Project, based on lived experience, have provided some really complicated scenarios when consent has come into play as an issue, and we're going to run training for prosecutors. We want to make sure that we're as well informed as we can be and able to prosecute cases because we want women to feel able to report and to be able to take those cases seriously.
Thank you very much.
Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the witnesses. I think your evidence has been really useful thus far. Just a couple of direct questions going on the Convener's point about time. Firstly, for yourself, Detective Superintendent, the Police Scotland submission says, and I know you've already mentioned it earlier, that there is a gap in the legislation with being able to police the off-street criminal sexual exploitation. Do you think that this bill would fill that gap?
I think if the legislation was, if we're absolutely clear on the criminality and when that crime was there, I think it could have.
Okay, and in terms of if the bill was to pass out, and I know Sian Dowie touched on this as well, so there is a risk of repeating yourself, and I'm sorry for that. One of the things when you're the last questioner of the committee. But how do you think the police would, how would you police that if the bill is passed? How do you think you would get in to fill that gap?
So we're doing lots of work in that space already, if I'm being honest, and trialling different things across different areas. Most of that is, when somebody, for instance, calls the police and reports a potential brothel that's operating, we'll always respond to that, and we'll deal with what's in front of us. what we've looked at is doing the safe and well, doing the joint visits, which I think is one aspect of doing that. So going along with support in place and having that level of engagement. So if somebody doesn't engage with the police can withdraw and take support to make sure that's safe and well there, and maybe that builds trust and confidence and actually, targets if there is exploitation happening or sexual offences to come out, that's there. I've also seen other work that's ongoing with targeting landlords. So the people that give up their addresses, short-term lets, allowing that, facilitating that essentially. So that's still very much ongoing, but that's another area to look at. Then, of course, looking at adult services websites themselves. But what part do they play in this in terms of that facilitation? So those are areas that we need to look at. Those areas that we've moved into that phase fairly recently, from looking at on-street, now looking really focused on off-street. But those are some of the areas we're looking at, and I think that of interest to see what works well out in that space and what didn't, what wasn't effective.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And a question for Dr Forbes and yourself, Liliana. Both of your submissions, as Jimmy Hepburn rightly pointed out as well, didn't make any comment on the provision for statutory right to assistance and support. But Dr Forbes, do you think that this provision, if the bill is enacted, do you not think that that would maybe help in terms of the other concern that you raised about women in these situations being witnesses? So if they're being supported and they're getting that support, and do you think that that would perhaps help them to be witnesses if they're getting trauma-informed support?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, and the same question for Liliana.
Yeah, I don't think anything to add. I think it will be very supportive, but I can also imagine that it will be a matter for resources to provide the services that are required for being meaningful and to fulfil the purposes of the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring Liam Kerr back in for a very quick supplementary.
It's a very quick supplementary that I'll direct to Detective Superintendent Bertram, please, and it follows Sharon Dowie's line of questioning earlier. You were asked about cost to the police earlier on. On the 2nd of October, the Daily Record reported, and this isn't a quote, it's just my summary that I've got here, Police Scotland has warned it couldn't afford to enforce a crackdown on paying for sex if MSPs back criminalisation, noting the force has not budgeted for such a change. The force estimates the bill could cost over £500,000 in its first 3 years, including capital and opportunity costs. DS Bertram, do you recognise this as a fair reflection of the implications to Police Scotland if this legislation is passed?
So I've done some digging on the article because I was keen to find out. People would normally come to myself and ask for a comment on that. So in terms of the crackdown, so we are doing work in that space just now. So it's probably not entirely accurate. I guess it's, as we probably discussed earlier on, it's how that looks. I think could have an impact on policing. But as in terms of just now, on a day-to-day basis, there's work ongoing across every city, across Scotland to target the prostitution offences.
Thank you.
Thank you. And a very brief question from Rachel Hamilton. And if I can ask our witnesses to be very brief in your answers.
Well, it's really for Detective Superintendent Stephen Bertram. But you were talking about having the powers to deal with trafficking. But what we've actually heard is that women are being enslaved, raped, financially controlled, and the numbers are terrifying. So my question, which I asked to previous witnesses, is should the bill extend criminalisation to those facilitating prostitution rather than just the buyer?
Well, I think that's certainly one of the focus we're looking at just now, off-street, looking at that landlord piece, certainly keeping one eye on the adult services website space as well. So I actually think it's much wider than that, and absolutely.
Okay. And just very briefly, in the evidence that you gave, you said that there's a gap in the current legislation, though, with being able to police off-street CSE, so child sexual exploitation, when there is no human trafficking indicators present. Is there any mechanism within this bill that would allow that gap to be filled?
So sorry, when this is the CSE thing, so I'm still commercial sexual exploitation opposed to child
sorry,
sexual
I meant to
exploitation.
say that,
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
I'm reading the acronym wrong.
No, absolutely. So recognise that gap's there is like the important part, and I think it's just about trying to nail the colours to the mast now in terms of what that legislation would look like, which I think is the important part. And I go back to that point of when would the crime be complete, because that's going to have a massive impact on how we police that. And I think it would potentially bridge that gap.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we've just run out of time. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions today. That's been really helpful. And I will suspend just for a very brief pause to allow a changeover of witnesses. So thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much indeed. So our next item of business today is to commence our pre-budget scrutiny, and today we are focusing on policing. So we will have 2 panels of witnesses today, and I intend to allow up to 60 minutes for each panel. And I refer members to papers 3 and 4. So welcome to the meeting this morning, Chief Constable Joe Farrell, Deputy Chief Constable Alan Spears and Ms Lynn Brown, Head of Finance with Police Scotland. So warm welcome to you all and thank you for sending your written submission. So can I now invite the Chief Constable to make a short opening statement and then we'll move to questions. Chief Constable.
Thank you. Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. Policing in Scotland is at a crossroads. Urgent decisions are needed to address the threat, harm and vulnerability we are seeing now. Reform of policing is a success and an outlier in the Scottish public sector. Against a backdrop of a reducing workforce, we've improved professionalism and competence while taking on new and more complex work. We're securing answers for families of murder victims and policing major events which contribute to Scotland's international standing and prosperity. We're empowering women to leave abusive relationships and improving our response to violence against women and girls. We're safeguarding the integrity of Police Scotland and implementing new legislation. Continuous reform is the new normal for Police Scotland. We are cutting bureaucracy and using technology, including AI, to deliver best value and redirect resources to frontline services. But we need some of the savings of reform. Over £2.5 billion more than doubly initially proposed was invested back into policing, should be invested back into policing. A flat cash funding allocation of for 26-27 cannot be delivered. We would immediately stop recruitment to reduce workforce numbers through retirement and resignation. However, this would not achieve the savings needed. This attrition would further reduce officer numbers to fewer than 15,500 by March 27, with a significant reduction in visible policing, prevention work, delays in responding to calls from the public, and a severe impact on our ability to respond to major events, and difficult decisions will be required. A minimum of £104.9 million uplift in cash terms enables us to stand still. After accounting for pay awards, increased national insurance contributions, non-pay inflation and other unavoidable costs. Any allocation below that would mean our workforce will shrink further. Existing pressure on our performance and our people, like strain on the public's confidence in our ability to prevent and investigate crime, and a high level of work debt owed to officers and staff will be exacerbated. I do not want to maintain a status quo in which we are already seeing those warnings. I'm often asked if I can keep Scotland safe within the funding available. Scotland is safe and will remain so. We do, and always will, prioritise our response to those who face the greatest threat, risk or harm. Poverty, geopolitics, cybercrime and civil unrest is driving a high level of demand, and the challenge for policing is evolving rapidly, illustrated by increasing online harm and threat, violence associated with organised crime and a high level of protests. The threat is now. The extent to which policing can work with the whole system to be preventative, proactive and to respond is impacted by the budget available. A further £33.7 million, equivalent to 2.2% cash terms uplift, will allow us to strengthen the workforce to address harm and vulnerability, contribute to community cohesion, ensure public trust to share information and public confidence that policing can prevent crime and tackle antisocial behaviour. I want to strengthen our response to digitally enabled and globally collected crime, to target sex offenders, organised criminals and extremists who are radicalising, recruiting, exploiting and abusing our children, and bringing illegal drugs and violence to the streets of Scotland. We must continue to improve our response to violence against women and girls, investigate cold cases, including COVID-related deaths. And importantly, I want to underpin this with additional local police officers to give communities identified contacts, put more hours into street patrols, help communities to prevent crime and antisocial behaviour, and give victims a better response. It is a crossroads, not a crisis, but decisions must be taken now to enable policing to deliver fully and at the pace needed on our vision of safer communities, less crime, supported victims and a thriving workforce. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. And can I commend the written submission? I found it extremely detailed and very, very helpful in reflecting just the changing demand across Police Scotland. I wonder if I can maybe start off just by referring to both your written submission and your comments just there a moment ago, and you make reference to requiring a minimum cash terms revenue uplift of £104.9 million pounds in 2026 to 27. And in addition, the SPA has told us that policing needs £93.9 million capital investment for the same period to deliver the basic rolling replacement programme of fleet systems and policing equipment. So I wonder if you can maybe just outline some more detail with regard to what discussions you've had so far with the SPA and also the Scottish Government about those figures, and what would be the consequences of a settlement that was less than that asked for?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So I'll start in relation to the ask around revenue. So to stand still, in order to meet our unavoidable costs, we require £104.9 million pounds. And then over and above that, we have put in our submission a request for £33 million in addition, in order to meet the threat, harm and risk that we are facing and that we can see before us. In relation to the capital, that is a mixture of rolling replacement in relation to estate, digital equipment and the equipment that we need for policing. But in addition to that, there's an element of transformation built into it, both in relation to our arrangements around public contact and digital ways in which the public can contact us, but also developing and investing around technology, automation to drive efficiency. If I can talk specifically in terms of the threat picture that I see that presents itself as we are here today. So what we've seen over the last year or so is that threat picture has changed significantly, driven by, as I said in my opening submission, technology, conflict across Europe and across the world, geopolitics, poverty, and those elements present new threats, and within technology presents new opportunities for people to commit crime, exploit vulnerable people. So we're seeing this change, and we're seeing a rapid change, and we've seen a change in the way in which crime is committed, both in terms of its complexity, its diversification, its reach beyond Scotland, beyond the UK, beyond Europe and across the world, and increasingly how young people are being targeted within that. And it's important for the committee, as I'm sure you keep a close eye in relation to numbers of officers and numbers of staff. Important for me to say that since the inception of Police Scotland, police officer numbers as they stand today are 900 less and police staff numbers are 700 less. And if we just consider the way in which the world has changed in that time, and the way in which the world has changed in the last 12 months since the last time I was here. So just to give you an example of the way in which the threat picture is changing. We are seeing increased activity around a terrorist threat, including counter-state threats, which people will be familiar with. You'll be familiar with the organised crime feud across the Central Belt that started earlier in the year. Currently now 62 people on remand in relation to that. We are managing 90 mapped serious and organised crime groups. That represents 1,000 people involved in serious and organised crime, some of them children. We're also seeing an increase around cyber and fraud as both a way in which to commit crime, but also in terms of that reach that crime now has. And money laundering is an issue that is on the rise, and we see that through our partnership work with the banks and them highlighting where there's suspicious activity. But this is the one additional or statistic that I would bring to the committee that I think needs careful attention as we discuss what the funding is for Police Scotland moving forward. So people will be familiar with online abuse of children, and that is often identified to us as an organisation through other law enforcement bodies. So last year we received just in excess of 700 notifications in relation to suspicions, information intelligence around online harm relating to children. In 1 year, that has increased to nearly 1,500. Now, on receipt of that, there is a considerable amount of work goes into identifying where the risk is, who the risk's against, how we safeguard those children, what the investigation then looks like, and then obviously moving into the criminal justice system. So I'll just repeat that, 700 to 1,500 in just 12 months. Because the committee might be asking themselves, well, why now? Well, if you just take that statistic, then that tells you why. We're seeing online enabled violence against young people, and we're seeing, and there are some positives in this, we're seeing higher reporting around rape, sexual offences and domestic violence. I think that demonstrates a confidence in us as an organisation, but clearly is complex work that we need to be directly involved in. And I'll just finish off with a couple of further points. Protest activity, you'll be familiar with this, over the last 12 months has increased rapidly, both again in terms of numbers, location, and the different dynamics that play out with people who want to make their feelings and their points heard. So we see that extra demand again in that area. In 3 years, the number of protests has doubled from just over 1,000 to over 2,000. So that obviously has an impact, predominantly the weekend, but we're seeing that activity during the week. So going back to the question in terms of the ask, what I've outlined to you there is why the ask sits across both our community policing footprint and an increase in resources there. And we've sought to just identify to you what additional specialist support is required to enable us to ensure that we can keep people safe and give people trust and confidence in Police Scotland.
Okay, thank you. That was a very comprehensive response, so thank you for that. I won't come in with a follow-up question, but so I will hand over directly to Liam Kerr and then Sharon Dowie.
Very grateful, Convener. Good morning, panel. Chief Constable, in your written submission, you set out that should you not receive the additional £113.4 million funding requested for strengthening the front line, this would result in workforce modernisation savings having to be identified. Can you put numbers on that, as in terms of officers, and what are the practical implications on policing should you have to make those savings?
Thank you. I'll ask my colleague Lynn to come in relation to the numbers. So when I've been before this committee previously, we've talked about workforce mix. So police officer numbers are clearly very important, but as crime changes, as technology changes, the skills that we need change in terms of our workforce. So within this year, we have diversified, modernised some of our posts and brought in civilian investigators. We've brought in people who have expertise in relation to data science, use of automation, in order for us to drive efficiencies in relation to the way in which we're doing our business. But to pick up your specific point in relation to the impact if we don't get the money, I'll ask Lynn to answer that specific question.
Thank you, Chief. Morning, everyone. So, yeah, the written submission obviously details the workforce modernisation, and that's essentially how we can release warranted officers to strengthen the front line and support that overall proposal around the community policing, organised crime, etc. So the workforce modernisation is predominantly staff posts, around 232 posts within that, and really the funding is required to enable that workforce modernisation to continue. So essentially, if we don't get the funding, it essentially leaves a funding gap, which we would need to find the savings if that funding settlement was less.
I understand. Chief Constable, your written submission also talks about an increased capital investment required of £93.9 million to deliver a basic rolling replacement programme of fleet systems and policing equipment. What are the implications if you don't get £93.9 million, and particularly will body-worn camera rollouts be delayed?
So progress in relation to body-worn video is moving at pace. We're more than 50% through the rollout of that. So that's really positive, both for us as an organisation, individual officer safety, but also for the wider criminal justice system in terms of driving efficiencies in relation to that. There's elements within that capital ask which enable us to replace equipment, kit and service our estate, and I'll ask DCC Spears to come in specifically around the estate in a moment. But what I'm keen that we do, and that features in that ask, is that we modernise the way in which the public can contact the police. So predominantly, if you want to contact us, that's by telephone. Clearly, in a modern age, we need to be able to offer people different ways to contact us that is convenient for them and allows us then to capitalise on the efficiencies that generates and drive the efficiency within our communication rooms. That's one element. There's elements in relation, as I say, to additional equipment in relation to modernising some of the way in which we are using our data and our systems, and then in addition to that equipment that's required by policing across a whole range of things. But specifically to your point in terms of the increases, I'll ask DCC Spears to talk about estate.
Thank you. The committee will be well aware that over the years Police Scotland have inherited a large estate, but we have in recent years seen that estate shrink. So we now have gone from about 550 premises to about 330 premises. The harsh reality for us is that a lot of those premises aren't currently fit for purpose, and much of the spend that we have in estates is quite simply to keep the mechanical and electrical elements of that estate working. So in the year that we're currently in, we have an investment of £21 million being spent across our estate. We have 140 live projects. We're halfway through the year. We will spend that entire estate budget. We've improved custody in Tayside. We've refurbished Braemar Mountain Rescue. We've relocated the Forfar Police Office. We've come up with a fleet solution for our vehicles in Edinburgh. And to support the welfare and wellbeing of officers, we've got a number of cosmetic enhancement projects that are running in this current year to improve the facilities for operational officers across the country. But most importantly, we've got a 5-year capital spend on transformation and to try and develop that estate. And I think to your question, Mr Kerr, our challenge would be our inability to realise the benefits of that estate transformation. It has proven difficult in recent years to address the state spend on a year-on-year capital. So our hope would be in years going forward that we would have a multi-year plan that would allow us to realise over the next 5 years the ability to develop and transform that estate.
Thank you. Chief Constable, these figures will have been prepared over a considerable time and projecting what's coming in the future. However, the Scottish Government is now proposing to release perhaps up to 1,000 criminals early between now and April. Did the Scottish Government seek advice from the police on the costs, based on previous release programmes, the costs that might be incurred by Police Scotland of any early release? And in any event, do you take a view on the SPF's campaign that's just launched on the Assault Police No Early Release?
Thank you. So in relation to the issue of overcrowding in prison, we've been part of, present during the discussions with officials in relation to the impact of that. And you will know that Scotland has the highest proportion of people in prison across a number of European countries. So when you look at that, you have to think that we haven't got that right in terms of why would we have a disproportionately high number of people in prison and the ongoing issues of violence and overcrowding. We talk in our bid about an increase and an uplift of 600 community police officers, and they, within that, they have a role in relation to prevention and proactivity and that visible presence on the streets. But they also have a role in terms of getting ahead of issues that drive criminality, working with local people, young people, to try and get ahead of the alcohol, the drugs, and other issues that drive criminality. So it strikes me that when you look at the prison numbers, some of the answer to how do we ensure that we've got the right provision, but also deal with the underlying elements around offending, is partly investing in good, strong community policing that gets ahead of some of these issues and takes that broader view. Because the early release and then the increases in numbers back of tipping over 8,000, I think is symptomatic of a group of people that will be going in and out of prison on a regular basis. And we have to collectively break that cycle. We have to work at a local level to identify those precursors to criminality and try and get ahead of the issue. And I think I'm right in saying the statistic is that it's £47,000 a year to keep somebody in prison, and it's £5,000 a year to wrap round good support to prevent reoffending. And it strikes me that that's where our focus needs to be. And I know that the former chair of the SPA has done some work on behalf of the Cabinet Secretary around how we strengthen community justice. And in some cases, I would be supportive of that with the right community policing footprint. That is not to say that it isn't the right and proper that people who commit crime go to prison and they feel the full force of both us as an organisation and the justice system, just so that nobody is any doubt about that. But you all know, and you can think of people in your constituencies who are probably youngsters, have probably had poor young lives, and we want to break that cycle. Collectively, we want to break that cycle. And I think part of the answer lies with us in that prevention space at a local level with partners.
One final question from me then, Chief Constable. You've been very candid and robust in your submission and in your remarks this morning. I was reading in the Sun last week a senior police source suggesting that if the police don't get the money that you say you need, that you've asked for in the submission, you wouldn't be able to do what you want to do, and you would consider your position. I think it's only fair I give you the opportunity to respond to that and say whether that's accurate or not. But regardless of the accuracy, how serious is it for you personally, given how frank you've been, if you don't get the money that you say you need?
So it's inaccurate, the reporting. I, within my tenure, I outlined a clear vision for Police Scotland: safe communities, less crime, supported victims and a thriving workforce. And I'm fully committed to that. I've operated within austerity in policing elsewhere in 2008, 9 and 10. So driving efficiencies, making difficult decisions is not something, it's something that I'm familiar with. What I'm presenting to the government and to you as a committee is my professional judgment in relation to the way in which the landscape that we policing are operating across Scotland and more broadly, how rapidly that has changed, and based on data and my professional judgment, the requirement for this organisation to ensure that we can deliver on that vision, and that's absolutely my commitment. But set in the context of this will require more resource. This will require more resource. We are probably unique, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're probably unique in saying we're the only public sector organisation in Scotland, maybe with the exception of Fire and Rescue, who have seen a reduction in resources since its inception. And we are still operating, and we're still keeping the people of Scotland safe, and we are meeting all of those additional demands. But we're at a crossroads, and the submission and my ask is that there is some reinvestment of some of the money that was saved, so that we can meet these threats, and that our policing with partners creates confidence and trust across the people of Scotland.
I'm very grateful to you all.
Thank you. Sharon Dowie, then Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you. Good morning. Following on for Liam Kerr's line of question, in the submission it says that you require £113.4 million in funding, additional funding for 26-27, and it will go towards funding 850 officers and 348 staff. Could I ask how you've concluded that these are the numbers of new officers and staff that are required for the workforce, and will this funding be sufficient to meet the frontline demand?
Thank you. When I was here last year with my colleague DCC Jane Connors, we talked and she spoke specifically about taking a more strategic view in relation to our resourcing and the type of people that we need within the organisation. So the submission highlights and details, I think there's 3 key elements to it, and we've outlined this in order to make it digestible. So there's an ask around community policing, 600 police officers, to strengthen our already existing community policing footprint. And then there's an ask in relation to an additional 250 police officers to work within our serious and organised crime departments, counter-terrorism, public protection, offender management, and the management of our major investigations. And then over and above that, 348 police staff who would be working in specialist roles in relation to that collective effort to manage threat, harm and risk. And I'll just give you some examples around intelligence development. I'll work with the prisons in terms of identifying individuals who pose the highest risk, our ability to operate across different communication networks, digital forensics, forensic accountants who follow money that criminals move around, investment around additional software engineers and data scientists. So I hope from that what you're seeing is that there is expertise that doesn't sit with police officers that is required to meet the threat that we face and that we can see, and we need the correct workforce mix in order to meet that.
I can understand that there'll be a kind of fluctuation between the amount of officers that you would need and the amount of civilian staff, because obviously somebody that's got digital expertise, if they're looking at cybercrime, they wouldn't necessarily be in the front line. So I can understand that the figures are changing, yes, but it's just to make sure that would be enough officers on the front line. So if I'm out and about speaking to the public, the issues I'll get is 101 calls, people staying on the line for half an hour or an hour or whatever, 999 calls where there's no response. I know that it does say within the submission about some crime statistics falling or staying the same, but there's an awful lot of reporting out there that crimes are not being reported in the first place because they haven't got time to sit in a 101 call or a 999 call and then not get a response. There's obviously the increase in antisocial behaviour. I actually spoke to retailers last week who, again, it was a specific one where it was a threat from a shoplifter that was going to stab them with a needle. They phoned 999 and they had no response. But then in the media, they'll see huge publicity around somebody that's getting charged with a broken umbrella. So is this enough funding that you will be able to go and sort these problems? Will you be able to put enough officers and civilian staff in to fix this so that we don't have recurring issues with the public?
Thank you. So we prioritise 999 calls over 101 by the nature of that. But I've talked, I just talked a bit earlier there in terms of investment around modern contact into our communication rooms, that it's not all by phone, that you can do that in the same way as we contact all other parts of our daily lives. And within that, I would seek to use the technology and the investment in the technology to improve our performance in relation to the points that you outline there. So theft from shops is something, an element of acquisitive crime that we've seen rise. And to my point around an additional 600 community policing officers, community in the broader sense, so it might be in a residential area, but also I'm talking about business communities, and I'm talking about our high streets and our shops, so that people feel safe to go, and that the people who run those businesses know that people will we'll identify those that are responsible. There is an organisation around it in some places, organised crime relating to shoplifting, and we've seen some good results through the additional £4 million around our retail task force. I would want to see that level of response across the whole of the country.
Okay, thank you. And moving on, just a final question. In your written submission, you stated that the costs of new legislation have not always been accurately described or illustrated in previous pre-budget evidence submissions, and note a financial impact for this of £4.5 million for 2026-27, rising to £22.9 million in 2028-29, which is a huge difference. Are you satisfied that the cost of new legislation, including the Police Ethics Bill, will be covered by the Scottish Government, and if not, what would be the impact of this funding not being received?
I think one of the challenges for us in the past with legislation is it's a bit of a hidden cost, and we've maybe failed or struggled to identify the implications and impact of the introduction of new legislation. And what we've tried to do in this submission is be really clear about what the cost around that would be. Now, some of that cost also relates to opportunity, where we draw resources away and officers away from their day job for training purposes. But we have worked really hard to try and be really clear about the impact of legislation, as important it is, and how we deliver that programme. And at this current time, we can see a number of different pieces of legislation coming together at one time. So we would be confident that we've tried to be clear about what the implications and the cost associated with that legislation would be.
Right. So have you put something in place so that the cost in the financial memorandum now will be a lot more accurate, so that we can see the cost of the bill before it's implemented?
Yes. So we would, and for example, in the recent submissions around the the Scrutiny and Ethics Bill, we from the very outset outlined what some of those costs would be, and we quantified them very specifically in our submissions back to government.
There is a big difference between the 4.5 million in 26-27 and going up to 22.9 in 28-29. What's the reason for that?
It's just a range of different legislations that's coming in. There are elements of legislation that would come in that has an impact on a proportion of the organisation, and then there's broader legislation that would impact right across the organisation. So it's just trying to precisely work out what the implications of any particular piece of legislation would be.
Right. And if you don't get that full amount for implementation of legislation, what are the impacts?
Our challenge is prioritisation. I mean, there's a real commitment from Police Scotland to deliver, and we work with the legislation that supports the services that we provide, but it brings us back to making difficult choices, and if it's a choice over prioritising training that relates to new legislation, then we will have to take that over what might be considered some less essential training. So our focus would be on just prioritising our workload, and some things would have to come back from that.
Okay. Right, thank you. Thanks.
Jamie Hepburn, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. Chief Constable Farrell, you talked about the need for budget to include the covering of increased national insurance contribution cost. Could you tell us what the cost has been this financial year to Police Scotland and what the forecast cost is for next year?
Thank you. Yeah, so as you say, the written submission clearly outlines the impact of the national insurance costs, and that was a result of the changes that were announced by UK Government in October last year. So that has had a 25 million plus pressure for policing in the current financial year. So as we say, that is a cost we are incurring now. We have managed that in the current financial year through additional in-year funding from Scottish Government, but also some one-off non-recurring benefits within our own budget. That's not sustainable going forward because, like I say, it is a cost that we are incurring now as part of our workforce, and with that our budget being predominantly workforce, that 86% is that a committed cost. So that's why our submission outlines that we really need that funding baselined going forward. So we've positioned it slightly different in terms of we want that baselined into our funding settlement going forward because it is that existing cost. So that has been captured as part of the pressures that's been put forward as part of the 104.9 million.
And have you got a forecast cost for the coming year?
So it's caught up as just as part of the impact overall. So I don't have a specific national insurance going into 26-27, but it's included overall as part of the 61.2 million that's pay award and uplifting
So just
costs.
focusing on £25 million, approximately how many police officers would that pay for?
500.
Okay, that's useful to understand. In the submission that you sent, which is very, very helpful, and thank you for doing so, and you touched on this as well in some of your responses thus far, Chief Constable, you've got a section that talks about emerging issues, and I want to go through a few that you've set out, and I appreciate you may not have an answer to the specific costs, so maybe something I have to come back to is when we talked about the fact we're now seeing anti-immigration protests focusing on hotels. I don't know if there's a way of working out what the cost has been to Police Scotland of that. You're always having to police the prescription by the UK Government of Palestine Action Group. I don't know if there's a figure in terms of the cost to Police Scotland. And obviously Operation Rule 2 happened, visit of President Trump, and you talk about the significant demand placed upon policing in Scotland, which we would all understand as a result of such a visit. What was the cost of that?
So, in relation to protest, what we're seeing is a significant increase in that space, driven by the things I've mentioned already that you're well aware about. So the policing of those protests, predominantly at the weekend, but we are seeing more activity during the week. And my professional view is that will continue to rise, given some of the both UK-wide issues and broader that people feel very, very strongly about. So we've seen the doubling of those protests over the last 3 years. And then in addition to that, what we're also seeing is an increased requirement around sporting events. So we are seeing some increased violence around football matches. Now, how does that manifest itself? In a number of ways in relation to an impact on our officers, predominantly our officers. So we are cancelling more time off in order to meet those requirements. And then if we can't give our officers those days back within 90 days, the regulations say that we need to pay them for that time. So when set against that reduction in police officers, what you're seeing is pressure on the organisation, pressure on the people, both in terms of cancelling the time off, either paying overtime or subsequently paying them additional recompense down the 3 months later, and that is having a stress and a strain on people, and I don't think it's a sustainable position, both in terms of the impact on individuals, but also the impact on the budget, because we're effectively having to use this budget this year, and we're overspending in relation to our overtime because of these additional demands, and we can see that impact.
So it is quantifiable, so you're able to, I appreciate you probably can't give me a figure here now, but you could tell us what the cost of policing anti-immigration protests in hotels are. You could tell us what the cost would be of policing the prescription of Palestine Action Group by UK Government and the Operation Role 2. We could get those figures, and if you've got information on violence associated with sporting events, primarily football, and that'd be probably helpful to understand too.
Yeah, we absolutely can give you that information, and it largely comes down to officers' time. So even if we take it the weekend that's just passed, in addition to policing planned sporting events, which is largely football, which took over 1,000 officers over the course of the weekend, an additional 300 officers were deployed to support protest activity across the country. And as the Chief Constable would say, we're drawing on people's own time, we're paying overtime, and it's having a negative impact at times. We're drawing officers away from the communities. But even in the month of September, our overtime spend was £3 million. A large part of that is driven by the demand that's getting placed on the services, and we can certainly come back with the exact and precise costs around Operation Role.
Yeah, it'd be really useful just broken down by each of those areas. And I think you've answered the question, so you know, that effectively you just have to deal with that within the budgetary envelope. It's not like you can forecast it or plan for it, or maybe you do. How do you? What's the operating assumption at the start of any financial year in terms of that type of event?
So some of those events are a given. We're going to know in advance, and you know, we have a really strong track record, both in relation to sporting events and other major events. We would always anticipate some level of protest, you know, democracy, supporting people's human rights. But to take you back to what I said right at the beginning, you know, events worldwide are affecting obviously what happens on the streets of Scotland. And in relation to some of those protests, you know, tactics change, and what we're seeing is, while some of the numbers aren't to the level that we've seen previously, they are very much at short notice. So we don't have the luxury that we have with sporting events, where we know the programme well in advance, where we're making quick decisions in terms of being able to support those protests that are popping up at short notice. We've got a really strong track record around engagement with people involved in their individual protest and their rights around that. But the tactics always change, because people, you know, want to make sure their voice is heard. So we are seeing that, and we're constantly having to evolve in that space.
Okay, if we could get the information, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fulton McGregor, do you want to come in with a quick supplementary, and then I'll bring in Pauline McNeill?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It's just a supplementary on the last exchange there about sporting events, and particularly football, and I want to home in on that, because this has been an issue that we've heard Justice Committee, going back for a long time, back to the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, if you remember that. And it does always seem, you know, really ridiculous that the police are picking up an absolute massive cost and resources there in relation to this. And what I wondered was, is it because it won't just be the events I'm taking it themselves, as in the actual matches, but you've seen protests at both Rangers and Celtic recently as well, which I know that police presence has been required for. So can I ask what sort of discussions are taking place with the clubs around this for them to manage their fans, and also is there any discussions about, you know, this is perhaps not for the police but maybe more for the government, but about clubs picking up some of the cost of this as well?
So I'll talk a bit about the cost, and then I'll ask Alan to come in relation to the broader issues. There was and I can't remember what year, but there was a judgment through the courts, which had going back so many years, that had a very specific impact and drew a line as to who picked up the cost for policing football matches. And the judgment was that the clubs would only pay for the policing within the stadium. So, you know, you can picture then what the impact is in terms of the policing before the match starts around the stadium and whichever city or town we're in, and then following. So the most of the cost is picked up through the individual organisations, policing organisations, and that's a ruling, and that's stood, and I think people have sought to challenge it, but it stood for some considerable time. But specifically in relation to other issues.
So I think we're well engaged with the football club, we're well engaged with local authorities, but our policing challenge around football is never in and around the stadium. It's in the broader context. So even again, if I take the Old Firm game at the weekend, we would have a relatively small footprint within the stadium, but we had over 800 officers deployed in and around the stadium and in and around Glasgow. So the demand on resources in the broader context, which allows people to go about their day-to-day lives, is really important. European football brings additional challenges, and we'll see that this week in Glasgow also. So that's where our draw on resources are. And it very much, from our perspective, feels as though it's a challenge for us to address, and we bear all the costs associated with policing the broader event.
Can I just add to that, because I wouldn't want the committee to be looking and thinking, well, what have you done yourselves to make some improvements in this space and maximise those resources? So we are working through a programme where officers who have jobs that are more either office-based or week-based are required now to offer some additional support at the weekends. So the reason I say that is, you know, in order for us to maximise our resources and I call it ring out as much as we've got within our own workforce. However, that comes at a cost, because the officer then is working at the weekend on maybe an event or a protest, but then needs to go back to their core role. But we are trying to squeeze as much out of the organisation to meet these demands. And just by way of just a further illustration, in excess of 90 officers have been moved from more, I'm going to say, back office function, which doesn't mean it's not important, but to frontline roles. So, you know, I wouldn't want you to think we're not looking at what are the opportunities to maximise the resource where we see these increased demands, whether it's at weekends or specifically in relation to areas of business that we need additional capacity.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning. Chief Constable, I wanted to ask you first about the closure of police stations. So we've seen some closures for different reasons, mainly budget, and there's a proposed list of further police station closures, but I think some of them are being held just to see what the budget outcome is. And that's not just concerning for communities, but for police officers as well. I'm thinking about one constituency in Glasgow. If Stewart Street were to close, I think the Baird Street would be the nearest one, but there's implications for everyone. So if the government conceded your request for this budgetary, both capital and revenue, what would it mean for this impending list of police stations? Would it give you room for manoeuvre here to save some of them? Thank you.
I think it would make a big difference in terms of how we develop our state. So one of our key themes is about transforming the estate, and if we take Glasgow that you've highlighted, we would like to see a different model. So we recognise buildings like Stewart Street and Baird Street probably are of a certain generation. They're not fit for purpose, they're expensive, they're difficult for us to operate, and we would like to see a different response and community model. We've worked hard over recent years around co-locations, so we've got over 70 co-locations across the country, but I think we would look to transform Glasgow in a way in which response officers play a very, very particular role. So we could have them in different locations, and we would look to develop a much more effective community hub model where our community officers and some of those response officers and teams could be more accessible to the public. So that would allow us to realise a much more innovative way of making use of an estate.
Thank you. Chief Constable, you told the committee that you might be the only public sector organisation, with the exception of the Fire and Rescue Service, that's taken such a reduction in the budget, and I'm aware of this. Have you had that conversation with the Cabinet Secretary? Have you put that to her directly, and what has the government's response been to that? Because it is an alarming thing, given what you've outlined to the committee and the challenges of policing and how important it is to communities.
So everything that we've discussed here today, I've discussed with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and she's fully aware of the details that you've seen today. She's fully aware of the threat and the threat landscape, and as I describe it, how that's changed in the last 12 months, and those discussions are ongoing with her.
Thank you. Just lastly, I just wanted to be clear in my mind about the numbers, because there's a lot of numbers. So you told the committee that I think you've already lost 900 officers. When, over what period was that?
So that 900 is from basically the inception of Police Scotland, and Alan will take you through the history of how the numbers have changed.
Yes, if we were to look at the summer of 2013 and we look at the summer of 2025, the variation in police officer numbers is around 900, and we've probably seen a more sharper reduction in our police officer numbers post-COVID, so over the last couple of years, and even in this current year, simply to make the budget work for us, we've seen our officer numbers go from 16,600 to 16,500. And when I say 16,500, we only reach that target on 1 or 2 days per month, just as officers retire. So we had a new intake of officers on Monday, which take our numbers to 16,531. In parallel, we've seen that reduction of staff numbers over the same period, slightly smaller numbers, but in totality, in that period, it's around 1,600 employees who've left the organisation.
And if there isn't an improvement to the proposed budget, I think Chief Constable also said that would it take the numbers down further than the existing establishment?
86% of our budget is spent on employee costs, so any reduction in that budget, we have very little movement in terms of non-employee costs, so any reduction in elements of the budget would have an impact on our workforce. We report monthly on police officer numbers to government, so any movement there would impact adversely on those numbers.
And just lastly, so the ask in the budget, I think Chief Constable, you said 600 community officers and then 250 I presume that would be experienced officers, or you can tell me, to work on the challenges of serious and organised crime?
So serious and organised crime, counter-terrorism, major investigations and public protection, so safeguarding, investigation of sexual offences and domestic abuse.
So that's...
the 850 officers and 348 staff. And within this submission we talk about that being over 2 years.
Over 2 years.
Over 2 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Katie Clark.
Thank you. And if I could maybe pick up on some of the points that have just been made, Chief Constable, and I hear very clearly what you're saying, particularly in relation to the increased threats. What we have seen over many decades, however, has been a shift in policing. And, you know, for local people and local communities, the constant complaint that you hear as an elected politician over many decades, this is not a new thing, is that increasingly when you call the police, when there's been an incident, they don't come, and there's just less police around. So there used to be police in communities in local towns and small towns. There was visible policing. And over a long time, there's been a move away from that. And that's been a deliberate policy. That there's been a decision that that's not the best use of policing resources. I've had that justified to me by people from the police on many occasions over many, many years. And that there is a need to centralise resource into some of the priorities that you've highlighted: counter-terrorism, organised crime, cybercrime. And there has been some success, there's absolutely no doubt. You've also spoken about the number of organised crime offenders that are in the prisons, and that is an example of some of the success. So there's been some success with that, and there has been many successes related to, for example, Gartcosh, but the cost has been that for local people and local communities, when they are phoning the police about a crime, about unjustifiable circumstances, they're not getting the service that they believe they're entitled to, and many people believe they're entitled to, and no doubt you would wish them to be entitled to. So part of the ask that you've come to us today with is for community police officers. So could you maybe say a little bit more about what you mean by a community police officer, and if we were able to persuade the Scottish Government to agree to your request, that it would actually mean more visible policing in communities, that it's more likely when there's incidents that the police would be available to provide that service. Could you maybe expand on that and maybe also talk, you know, if you want, about some of the pressures, but how do we drive resources so that there is a better service in communities?
Okay, thank you. And I'll just go back to the early part of the question and what you've described there. And you talked about a deliberate decision, and I think there were deliberate decisions, and it goes back to that threat picture. So over time, we need a response to modern slavery. We need additional resources around safeguarding, around vulnerability, around domestic violence. So these were all right and proper decisions. But what it's left then is not that community policing footprint that I would want and that you describe as not meeting the needs of the communities. That's not to say we don't have good community policing, but in my view, it needs further investment so that we have visibility, we have named individuals that people know, that we build relationships with people, that we take our part with partners in safeguarding people, in ensuring that we're dealing with, in terms of a scale of antisocial or criminality, might be at the lower end. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't have a significant impact on those people. And to your point there, in terms of our successes around serious and organised crime, all of that is obviously happening in communities. These are people's neighbours. These are the people they see across the road with money, with cars. So it's really important that when you look at what we've asked for in the submission, I describe it as an ecosystem. We need strong community policing that people can rely on, that is responsive and that people know that they're going to get that good quality, both initial response and investigation. And at the same time, that forms part of the ecosystem that supports the areas of business, that more specialist areas of business, but they operate as a whole. And just to go back to Operation Portalage, the response to that was a number of different resources, and part of that was community police officers who were visible in those communities, who were trying to reassure people at a time when they were seeing criminality that we hadn't seen, I don't think for some time, if ever. But important to me that with the additional investment, better response, better quality investigations, and also that visible presence to get ahead of issues, working with partners, problem solve, prevention is what you could expect.
So very briefly, what you're saying is those 600 community police officers would primarily be community focused. I appreciate they may get called off on occasion to do other things when there's a big event, but in broad terms, they would be focused in communities. So you would hope that that would have an impact in terms of that visibility in communities and the feeling in communities that they're getting a better service. Is 600, what kind of impact will 600 make across Scotland?
So 600 in addition to what we've already got.
Okay, and you think that would be sufficient to make a tangible difference?
The authority have scrutinised a piece of work in relation specifically around policing our communities and what is reasonable and what would bring the differences that you describe people need to see.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I know we're just a little bit over time, but if I may, I'd like to come in with a final question, Chief Constable, and it relates to some work that is going on in the Parliament across committees, looking at their individual sectors and portfolios in the context of what public sector organisations are doing to reduce emissions. And obviously, we're collectively looking to address climate change. So I'm just interested, albeit if it's a brief comment, in relation to what work is ongoing within Police Scotland to reduce emissions.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. We have a sustainability team working in Police Scotland, and only in the last SPA board meeting did we present an annual report around sustainability, and what that report showed was considerable progress around reducing our footprint. I think what became really evident in our session was that we've taken the state in some ways as far as we possibly can. I think we've got an incredibly strong fleet, and a large proportion of our fleet is EV, and we have an ambition, as you know, to continue to progress that. So we are reporting regularly. It features on our monthly meetings around the progress we're making, and we're quantifying the progress that we're making, and that information was publicly presented to the last authority meeting.
Yeah, thank you for that. And is that work, that important work, is that absorbed into your the budget submission that you've provided, or you're just obviously looking at this from a budget perspective and what the implications of this work are in the context of your policing budget?
Lynn will be able to say just a little bit more about the budget, but we've been very successful over recent years in looking at what other grant opportunities exist to help us in that space, and we have been able to draw down additionality to make progress with that. But in our spend, whether it is around the estate or whether it's around fleet, sustainability is at the heart of the decisions we're making around that. But Lynn may offer a comment just on the budget.
Yeah, so just overall, the sustainability team is part of our sort of core budget, so that's included within the revenue budget. But as the Deputy mentioned, fleet and estates is probably a key area of investment in terms of sustainability going forward, in terms of modern fit for purpose estates, etc. So that is outlined in our written submission, and the capital expenditure plan is within that. In terms of the you know, the investment required in fleet over the medium term and the investment required in the estate. But the key aspect of that is that multi-year impact in terms of the investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're just over time, so apologies for that. Thank you all very much. That's been a really helpful session. And we'll just have a very short suspension to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I wonder if I can welcome to the meeting Fiona McQueen, Chair, Alistair Hay, Vice Chair, and Chris Brown, Chief Executive and Accountable Officer with the Scottish Police Authority. So a warm welcome to you all, and thank you for your written submission. And just to remind members, I intend to allow around about 60 minutes for this session. So can I invite Fiona McQueen to make a short opening statement, and then we'll move to questions.
Convener, members, thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to the committee's pre-budget scrutiny. So when developing the budget for the years ahead, the authority has two essential objectives. Firstly, allocating funding that delivers an effective and sustainable police service for Scotland, and secondly, continued effective financial management through setting a balanced budget and also ensuring best value. Our focus is on ensuring that the budget clearly sets out priorities supported by evidence, realistic timescales and transparency about any implications, enabling public understanding and effective authority oversight. Policing in Scotland continues to be a strong example of what structural reform can achieve, and while reform was not without challenge, it has delivered equity of access to specialist service for every community across Scotland, improved operational performance, and demonstrated that significant efficiencies can be achieved through amalgamation and collaboration. Police Scotland's performance remains high, from managing major events to maintaining one of the strongest homicide detection rates in the UK. And the service is held in high regard nationally and internationally. Reform has also delivered on the wider expectations of public service reform, prioritising the front line, working collaboratively with partners, and aligning with government priorities on sustainability, fairness and economic resilience. However, the operating environment for policing, as we've already heard this morning, is becoming increasingly complex. Crime is changing, civil unrest is rising, workforce pressures are real, and public confidence has unfortunately declined. And these are signals that we therefore cannot ignore. The Chief Constable has set out a clear 2030 vision for modern, responsive and sustainable police service, one that strengthens the front line, supports victims and builds safer communities. The authority fully supports her operational assessment and the additional investment required next year to maintain that trajectory. But we also recognise that even maintaining current capability will require a further 104.9 million by 26-27, simply to meet unavoidable cost pressures such as pay, inflation and new legislation. Capital investment remains a critical constraint, with the 93.9 million proposed for 26-27 will sustain essential replacements of fleet, systems and equipment, but does fall short of what is needed for modernisation and technology-driven efficiencies. Multi-year allocations, retention of capital receipts or restoring borrowing powers could all help ease that pressure. And finally, Convener, I want to reassure the committee that the authority recognises the importance of effective oversight. We are proud and supportive of policing, but we are equally committed to robustly testing and challenging the service to ensure efficiency, effectiveness and continued improvement, and to provide Parliament with clear assurance that policing is delivering best value for the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that opening statement. So I wonder if I can just begin with a general opening question, very similar to the one that I asked the Chief Constable in our earlier panel. So I wonder if you can just outline whether or not the Scottish Police Authority supports the case made by Police Scotland for uplifts of nearly £105 million in revenue and 94 million in capital for the year 2026 to 27. And if so, what discussions have you had with the Scottish Government, and what action might be required if the settlement for Police Scotland is less than that requested?
So we've had discussions with with Scottish Government. We've also had many conversations with Police Scotland in terms of what their budget ask is. We are supportive of it in terms of needing that to move forwards. And of course, at the same time, we are constantly looking to ensure that we have evidence of improvement, continuous improvement, standards of policing, as well as broader efficiency savings, which Alan Spears has rightly said are difficult given the large proportion of budget that's on workforce. But we have had that wide-ranging discussion. And depending on what budget we'd have delivered for us next year would depend on the action that would be needed to be taken by Police Scotland. And I'll ask Chris to come and say a bit more.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Convener. I think it's always worth reinforcing that the 104 million that you described is actually the standstill position. So that's the funding that would result in effectively no change from today. It would cover pay pressures, national insurance that we've spoken about, and some inflationary pressures as well. It's the additional 33.7 million, which is the beginning of the Chief Constable's ambition to recruit those extra 850 officers and 340 additional members of staff as well. So not providing the 33.7 would obviously jeopardise these plans immediately. Anything short of the 104.9 would mean some kind of reduction required. And as we've heard from our colleagues in Police Scotland, with 86% of the cost base being workforce, realistically that would mean a reduction in the workforce as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I wonder if I can just stay on funding. One of the issues that's come up over the last few years in our budget scrutiny has been multi-year funding and the benefit of multi-year funding. And I think in your written submission, you continue to seek more appropriate funding arrangements, including multi-year funding. And that, I suppose, provides the ability to carry forward reserves and statutory borrowing powers. I wonder if you could advise, again, of any sort of conversations or engagement with the Scottish Government regarding multi-year funding, and if you've made any progress in this regard.
So, yes, it's been part of the conversation ever since I can remember, to be honest. And I think, you know, if we see the next budget round as a spending review, then we would certainly hope to have some kind of multi-year certainty, particularly in capital spend. The specific issue with capital is that we are entering into long-term commitments to spend money. So kind of living hand to mouth every year is definitely a suboptimal position to be in. So any multi-year certainty we could have in capital would be particularly welcome. It's also welcome in the revenue side as well. But I think with capital, when you're trying to land very precisely on, you know, a capital budget every year, you maybe make decisions that you wouldn't ideally make in terms of value for money. So having multi-year certainty coupled with some kind of ability to carry forward reserves, for example, or even to borrow, and that's another argument that we've been making consistently over a number of years, I think would certainly help us plan for the future better and be able to build the momentum that we need to address the legacy estate in particular. Yeah,
thank you. And I suppose maybe coming back to Fiona McQueen, just in that landscape then, Katie Clark asked the first panel a question with regard to community policing and, you know, trying to kind of embed, make sure that community policing is a very clear part of the policing response in Scotland, but bearing in mind the complexities and challenges of shifting crime types that the Chief Constable took a fair bit of time to outline. I think we all understand that. So, how confident are you that, you know, in the fiscal climate that we're facing, that it is possible to achieve that optimum policing response that provides that reassurance in communities, but also is able to effectively respond to the more complex policing challenges that are emerging and that the Chief Constable set out?
The Chief Constable referred to the fact that they've had dialogue with ourselves in terms of providing the evidence for that community policing service. And she also talked about the ecosystem in terms of, although in the individual's minds we have community policing and we have response policing and we have the other more centralised services, they are all interlinked. And what we would do is we would expect Policing and Performance Committee that Alistair chairs to look at the evidence that we are. So I think any additional budget that the Police Scotland would get, we would be looking for evidence of implementation, effective implementation, and would make sure that that was actually being put to used for the intention that it was, and that would be community policing. Now, some of that is measurement, how many officers are there on the beat. Some of it is other data, such as public confidence, that we would expect to see increase for that. So that's the way we would take our approach going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll maybe come back to that later, but in the meantime I'll bring in Liam Kerr, followed by Jamie Hickley.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Chris Brown, you heard me earlier investigate the potential consequences on the police workforce if they don't receive the additional resource funding that they've requested. And just in your remarks to the Convener earlier on, you said that that would mean fewer officers or fewer personnel. So what do you understand to be the implications that not receiving that full funding requested and a reduced workforce would have on policing in Scotland going forward?
I suppose it would depend on how much of a shortfall there was against what's being asked. So I suppose we have a range of scenarios between flat cash, receiving the standstill funding, and then on top of that, you know, and this is the scenario that we want to support, receiving the additional funding for the extra resource that the Chief has asked for. If we take flat cash as an extreme, so in other words, no additional year-on-year revenue funding, to be blunt, we would not be able to set a balanced budget in 2026-27. It wouldn't be possible. It would take 2 years of a recruitment freeze, essentially, to balance the budget under that scenario. And the reason that's the case is because so much of what is being asked for is already committed. And the genesis of most of that ask is the 2-year pay award that we recently agreed with staff and officers earlier this year. And obviously we have the national insurance on top of that as well. So in the extreme case, it would mean mothballing the police college for 2 years. Right? And that's obviously very, very serious indeed in terms of the implications that would have on policing in Scotland. But I emphasise that's the extreme scenario if we were to go with flat cash. And just using the ready reckoner that my colleague Lynn Brown clearly used earlier, for every 25 million of a shortfall, that would equate to roughly 500 officers or staff.
Thank you. And you heard me earlier talk about the capital side of things as well. So in your submission, or in the SPA submission, it says that underinvestment in the estate and technology is one of the most pressing issues, and that the move to the single force has exacerbated that. The written submission suggests that Police Scotland require an increased capital investment of £93.9 million to deliver a basic rolling programme, fleet systems and policing equipment, and that doesn't even include some other things that would ideally be done. So again, the question begged is, what would not receiving that increased investment mean for that basic programme? What are the practical implications for policing?
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. I think the first thing to say is that the integration of the legacy forces hasn't in itself exacerbated a problem of underinvestment. It's simply been a function of how much capital there has been at any point. So I think these two things are probably slightly independent of each other, and there is actually a fairly good argument that some of the investments that we have made have only been possible as a result of having an integrated organisation where things are delivered once rather than multiple times. I think that specifically applies to technology-type investments. Estates, completely different. Having that integration, I suppose, opens up possibilities to consolidate and reduce the footprint, etc. But I digress slightly. I think in terms of a shortfall of the 93, then it becomes, in the States in particular, it becomes a bit more of a retrenchment into basic health and safety and just simply maintaining buildings. So for context, the maintenance backlog for our estate currently sits at £245 million. And that number will only get bigger if the estate is not modernised. So, and I think that the Chief added a bit of nuance earlier. The 93 million is not just rolling replacement. It is starting to build some momentum in technology and estates to ramp up to a higher level of capital spend year on year, which is around the 150 million mark. It's just we're starting from 70 million this year. So next year would be essentially a transitional year to ramp up to the levels that would be required, in particular to address the legacy estate and to properly modernise it, which is something that over the last 10 years has not been done to any great extent.
Yes. So just to clarify my point about the single force, was because in your submission you said it was the borrowing powers that were lost as a result of going to the single force, but it's an important point. Anyway, very grateful to you all. Convener.
Very much. Jamie Hepburn and then Sharon Dowie.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'd like to focus my questions actually on the authority's own corporate costs and corporate function. Clearly it's very important that the oversight role you have, that you're appropriately funded, and your submission makes clear that the corporate function was allocated 0.4% of the policing budget in 25-26, that being £5.5 million. And you want to say when benchmarked against other similar policing oversight bodies, this reflects favourably. Can you've obviously set that out as a statement. Can you evidence that? Who are we talking about? Who else are you comparing yourselves to, and what's the equivalent amount of funding they receive?
Well, I think we would argue we do provide value for money as an oversight body in terms of cost effectiveness. I think a recent move from Pacific Quay to Kilmarnock again has demonstrated efficiency savings that's meant that we've been able to live within our budget, flat cash, and anything else then can go to Police Scotland. But I'll ask Chris to say a bit more about the overall benchmarking.
I think we benchmarked favourably to Metropolitan Police and PSNI, for example. These are the two that I can remember off the top of my head. The other thing that's probably worth remembering is that the costs that we incur as a corporate body also include costs that benefit all of policing, including Police Scotland and forensic services. So, for example, internal and external audit fees, which are in the region of many hundreds of thousands of pounds. So the circa 5 million that's described there actually includes costs that are not specifically related to our oversight function.
Okay, so it's really a comparison within the UK with other authorities. Okay, might be worth us looking into it a little further ourselves. A similar question to that I asked Police Scotland themselves. What is the cost to the police authority in terms of the increased national insurance contributions?
We clearly have an increased cost. I'm going to hand to Chris for more detail of that.
I don't know what the number is specifically for us. It's obviously going to pale in comparison to Police Scotland, but the number that was provided earlier was for the whole of policing, including the authority and forensic services as well. Yeah,
oh, that's,
so the 25 million is all inclusive.
That's useful clarification. Okay, no, that's helpful to understand. In terms of the chair of the authority has given an indication of how some of this has been achieved. The submission talks about the savings delivered during this year, amounting to around £300,000. Just, I suppose the first question is that against the budget of 5.5 million, i.e. expenditure will be 5.2 million, or would the budget otherwise have been 5.8 million?
The budget would otherwise have been 5.8.
Okay, no, that's useful to understand as well. And it then goes on, your submission then goes on to say, remain committed to driving further efficiencies in your own activities. Could you set out what that might be at this stage? Can that become a quantifiable cost at this moment in time, or would that be something that would emerge down the line?
It's not something that I could put a figure on just now, but we are constantly looking at ways to organise ourselves and to put it simply, spend as little as possible. I think we see... we take our position as a scrutiny body very seriously, and therefore we have to live by the standards that we would seek to impose on Police Scotland, so to speak.
No, that's helpful to understand as well. Maybe as it emerges going forward, I think it'd be something the committee would be interested in terms of what further steps are being taken. That's all, Convener.
Thank you. Sharon Dowie, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning. same kind of questions that I asked for the last panel that we're in Police Scotland's written submission. They stated that the costs of new legislation have not always been accurately described or illustrated in previous pre-budget evidence submissions. Are you satisfied that the costs of new legislation, including the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Act, will be adequately covered even if Police Scotland's budgetary requests are not met in full by the Scottish Government?
I think as the oversight body, we absolutely have to ensure that Police Scotland respond to new legislation in a safe, proportionate and effective way. So through that oversight, we would ensure that that happens. Clearly, if the additional costs weren't met, then it would need to be met from additional moving of budget around. And sometimes that's not as concrete as we would like it to be, but it's certainly something in terms of our oversight we would see. And that comes through reporting, whether it's through the People Committee, if it's training, through policing and performance, if there's enactment of new legislation, and clearly our Complaints and Conduct Committee will be looking at the new Police Ethics Bill.
So what are the implications if you don't get the full budget settlement for that?
Money would need to be moved from elsewhere within the budget. So that may then be staff reduction in other areas, or it may be stopping of a particular, whether it is a piece of training or and shifting resources that we would need to see that was prioritised.
Okay. And I was just going to ask a wee bit about the forensic services as well. If you can provide an update on the work that's been done and the potential future impact on revenue and capital budget requirements. I wanted to ask specifically, in the submission it says that forensic services are being delivered at a cost of £47.4 million in the current 2025-26 financial year, which represents 3.2% of overall policing budget. And we don't expect this percentage to significantly change in the year ahead. I'm just wondering, because obviously we know that we've got a big drug problem. There's obviously an increase in drug driving, but also you'd mentioned in the submission about public confidence declining. And one of the things that there seems to be a correlation with is there's a lot less road traffic officers, but there seems to be an increase in drug driving. Again, that might be due to not having enough toxicology checks, but also there's an increase in accidents as well. So are you confident that in the figures Police Scotland have given for the increase in numbers, will that allow more road traffic officers as well to go out? And do you have enough money for forensic services?
So in terms of the prioritising of deployment of police officers, that is a matter for the Chief Constable, and I'll maybe bring Alistair in a moment to talk about policing and performance in terms of how that performance is overseen and reviewed, whether it is road policing, whether it's accidents or not. With regards to the drug driving, as you know, the government committed money to put in the new drug driving, the swabs that were out with all traffic officers, and there have been a successful pilot in Shetland to roll that out, and as you possibly know, Ms Dowie, it's coming into East Ayrshire, and I think Aberdeen's the other area in terms of gradual rollout, so that we can test how much forensic services additionality there would be for additional drug testing for the drug driving. And that will be monitored, and we're satisfied that certainly next year we'll have sufficient money within the forensics budget. We have to outsource some of the testing, but we're satisfied that we have a sufficiency to do that as we go forwards. I don't know, Alistair, can you say a bit about how we monitor the performance?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think it's good afternoon now to everybody on the committee. Thanks for the question. In terms of performance, what we do is we start off with a strategic policing plan, and feeding into this strategic policing plan is Vision 2030, where the Chief Constable's already set out the ambition for safer communities, less crime, supported victims and a thriving workforce. We've just agreed this year a new performance and accountability framework, and in that performance and accountability framework there's a number of strategic indicators that indicate whether progress is being made towards these ambitions, and importantly through those towards the delivery of the strategic policing plan. Sitting underneath this, there's key performance indicators, and then sitting underneath this, there's some detailed management information and we have the opportunity to scrutinise and to delve down into management information if the strategic indicators or key performance indicators indicate that that's necessary. So one of the areas, as you've highlighted, that's come up is a concern over roads policing. So at the recent Policing Performance Committee, we had a presentation from the newly appointed Chief Superintendent into roads policing, who's bringing forward a strategy for policing, roads policing. So what we will be able to do as this evolves is we'll be able to exhibit a real curiosity around this, but really check and test that the projections that he's making, that the evidence, that the resource that is required is actually delivering against the ambitions contained within that strategy, but then how these feed up into the ambitions that the Chief Constable has set out in Vision 2030. So there's a comprehensive oversight and performance and accountability framework that surrounds all of this. And if things are not going as planned, we will ask for explanations. But to be very fair to Police Scotland, if things are not going as planned, they use that management information that they have to make adjustments, and decisions, as the Chair says rightly, ultimately will lie with the Chief Constable and how she will allocate the resource available to her.
Kitty Clark.
And Alistair, here you've used the word curiosity, and I would be interested in understanding a little bit more about how issues of concern are identified by the authority. I mean, we know that there has been a reduction in public confidence, which has been referred to. We've also had very serious allegations about sexism and misogyny. We've got the Shako Bio inquiry that's been going on for a very lengthy period of time. And there's clearly allegations about racism in the police force. We also have concerns raised about some of the policing of protests, for example, Palestine Action. So how does your organisation, how do you identify issues of concern? Because you've spoken about it in quite a managerial way, and I'm trying to understand how you work to try and drive the kinds of changes that you identify as required in the police, given some of the concerns that get raised by the public.
The issue of discrimination in terms of sexism, misogyny, racism and other forms of discrimination. We gain data and information on a number of ways for that. So we do our own public polling. We have, there's a Complaints and Conduct Committee that will look at complaints. We also have our internal survey in terms of, so there's the two components to that. So there's the internal sexism and misogyny and racism, and there's the external towards the community. And we expect to see a response from Police Scotland that demonstrates, and we are absolutely confident that the Chief and her senior team are committed to ensuring cultural change. And we receive reports, whether that's through policing and performance in terms of some aspects of it, or more likely the People Committee in terms of others, where we see the practical differences that that's making for people. Now, cultural change it takes time, and we recognise that, and not being complacent, that it's continuing to need improvement, but we're confident that there's a commitment from Police Scotland to make these changes. And as we look at the changes, the evidence that they are putting changes in place, we are then now looking at evidence of that being effective and making a real difference, and very practical difference. In terms of policing, and we have had, in recent times, we've had our authority meeting, we had the report on policing together at our last meeting, which it takes essentially over all of the discriminatory points and the cultural change. We also received reports at the authority meeting on policing of protests, and we're expecting a further update from that at our next authority meeting. So we do have to work through our systems and processes, but we have a variety of ways, whether it is looking at triangulation and testing out what is happening, as long as the data that's coming, as well as the independent polling that the authority does for that too. Alistair?
Perhaps, could I ask what your organisation's assessment is of the scale of the challenge, of how bad it is, I think that would be helpful for the committee.
So there are many, many areas of good practice across Police Scotland in terms of where people are treated with respect, without prejudice, and that happens day to day on our high streets, in people's living rooms, in the big incidents. There are also areas where improvement is needed, and that is, I think, where we have to focus. Yes, we want to build on success and make sure that we shine a light on what's good about the action that's been taken, but we recognise, I think, there is still some way to go, not being complacent, to make real and tangible changes. And we have, in terms of the internal element of it, we have Your Voice Matters. We're expecting the results to come in for that, and that will be probably, we had the baseline last year, so that will be the first year that we've seen, we should see, I'm hoping for improvement, but we'll see what the data shows us in terms of taking that forwards. So I think some areas where things are going well and we can see that and measure it and it's tangible. I think in other areas we are still needing to continue to press for significant improvement until we finally eradicate discrimination.
Yeah, and just to expand slightly, not specifically on the discrimination part of it, but we've also got very strong links into local government. We meet up on a regular basis with local scrutiny conveners. In the Policing Performance Committee, we actually have regular attendance from COSLA, who have a standing part in that, so we can get opinions, thoughts, views there. And we've also got third-party assurances and from people like Audit Scotland, obviously our best value report is due in the near future, and also the HMI. So there's a wide variety of stakeholders that we feel it's important to listen to take advice from, and to take evidence from that informs us going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wonder if I can just come in at this point with a couple of questions. The first was a question that I asked the Chief Constable just at the end of the session relating to tackling climate change and the climate crisis. Obviously this is an issue that all public sector organisations are looking at in terms of reducing emissions. So I'm just interested in perhaps opening up a question to yourselves with regard to how Police Scotland is working with the SPA to address operational emissions in line with our quite ambitious Scottish Government targets around net zero, and I suppose specifically the oversight that you can offer Police Scotland in that space. So,
I think as DCC Spears pointed out, we had the annual, in terms of our oversight, we have an annual report, and that came to our last meeting in August, where we had a very detailed dialogue and discussion. We noticed and recognised good progress is being made in many areas, and I think a lot of the funding has come, they've been managed to be sourced for the additional funding that has been made available, along with ongoing, so when there's routine maintenance or refurbishment of properties, that in itself can help and move things forwards in terms of our climate targets and availability, as well as some operational issues in terms of whether it's if there's big events, how we manage to provide food and fluids for officers. So it's wide-ranging to some very, very practical reduction of use of plastics, to the bigger, more strategic issue in terms of what's happening with our buildings and how do we manage to respond to the greening of these buildings in a safe and effective way.
Yeah, just to add, I think two really important points that came out in that board meeting. The first one relates to the estate. In fact, they both relate to the estate. The first one being that embarking on a programme of modernisation allows the organisation to design in efficiency from the beginning, rather than having to patch things up later. So I think it kind of underscores the importance of the estate's modernisation programme, not just to provide a great place to work and for communities to interact with, but also to address carbon emissions as well. the flip side of that, I suppose, is some of the reductions that we saw in Police Scotland's carbon emissions related to the disposal of buildings. And many of these buildings will go elsewhere in the public sector and potentially just move the problem somewhere else as well. So I think when it comes to the state in particular, a more holistic approach, I think, would be needed to ensure that the actions that we're collectively taking are in the round contributing to reducing emissions.
That's helpful, and it's an interesting point that you've made just at the end there, which I hadn't really thought about, but does make sense. I suppose just sort of broadening this out, I'm just interested in perhaps any comments that you have with regard to the public services reform strategy and how that is supporting the SPA and Police Scotland with regard to a range of areas of reform, but also perhaps does that present challenges as well? It's quite a general question, but quite interested in how that strategy is supporting Police Scotland as one of our public sector organisations.
So I would see an opportunity for other people to learn from Police Scotland and SFRS in terms of having undergone reform and what that has meant. I think in terms of there are so many partners that Police Scotland have that I suspect if there were to be reform that streamlined the partners that Police Scotland linked and liaised with, then that might be more helpful and more efficient in terms of being able to do that.
Okay. Would you like to come in, Alistair?
Yeah, I would underscore that I think, and the Chief Constable said it as well, that Police Scotland have been an exemplar of reform, not without challenge, as the Chief Constable did recognise. But I think that there's two things where Police Scotland can add real value. It is a national service and it has a very powerful convening force. It can bring partners together, and I think that plays very much into the Team Scotland ethic, that we are a collective public service, and Police Scotland have been an exemplar of that, and I think they can work very closely to see that as a whole we will deliver far more for the people of Scotland than we will if we stay isolationist and protective of our own boundaries.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I wonder if I can just ask another question, which is shifting into the mental health space. And I know this is an area that the SPA have been very invested in over the last few years. And you were aware that Police Scotland and staff organisations have been looking at this perhaps more robustly than before, and certainly in their written submissions they outline some of the current workforce pressures in terms of the levels of assaults, overtime, which the Chief Constable spoke about earlier, and time due to officers. So I'm just interested in what work is continuing to be undertaken with regard to this particular issue around officer and staff well-being, but also perhaps in the context of the operational demand coming from people who are in distress, and perhaps in the context of the impact on budget provision, because we know this is probably one of, if not the biggest policing challenge that we're dealing with today.
I think what's important, if I take the members of the public in terms of mental health distress and the policing response to that, I think what's important is that people who are in mental health distress get timeliest response to their needs, and the right person is able to help them. So for a lot of these cases, police is going to be the first part of response in terms of someone is in mental health distress. I think thereafter what's important is the handover of whether it's into health or social care, and there is a lot of work going on, as you referred to, I think, Convener, in terms of working strategically across services, so whether it's with local authorities, but in particular our health colleagues, in terms of being able to provide support to officers, to give them advice about what to do, but also providing them with the person in mental health distress a timeous assessment to determine what the best level of support is for that person. And there are a number of pathways that have been developed so that people can receive that right care and that right support that they need at the time. That is, in some areas, that's going very well, and there are numbers of hours that we maybe, I don't know if we have them to hand today, but we can certainly give the committee them, where police officer hours have been saved. So rather than whether it's sitting in ED or supporting someone in mental health distress in their home, they've been able to support that person and hand over to another colleague, and they've been able to get back onto their policing duties. We want to see that rolled out across the country, and there is we work in partnership with local government, with Scottish Government, to make sure that that happens in a timeous way along with our health colleagues. In terms of the workforce, then clearly one of the most important things that we can do is support the health and well-being of the workforce, both physical and mental health. We're talking about mental health here. There has been a recent, over the last, I think, 12 to 18 months, change in the approach that has been made available to providing that psychologically safe and supportive workforce for staff. Because no matter how much we don't want it to happen, police officers and staff see some of the most distressing consequences of human activity than any of us ever do. And therefore, they are going to be exposed to trauma and stress. And what we need to do is make sure the right managerial and supervisory arrangements are in place, and where necessary, the right backup and support, whether it's clinically or from an occupational health point of view, is made available for staff members. And that reports in through the People Committee and has shown an improved level of service available. But again, clearly we need to make sure that we want to see that in tangible evidence and outcomes in terms of data, because having a thriving workforce is absolutely key to providing a developing service, as indeed is one of the Chief's ambitions of our 2030 vision. I don't know if you want to...
It was just really to add a couple of numbers to what Fiona just described. So the Mental Health Task Force, the work of the Mental Health Task Force thus far saved the equivalent of 20,000 hours in 2024-25 across just over 4,000 referrals. However, that is against a backdrop of 650 mental health related incidents a day that the police have to respond to. So it's an enormous commitment from Police Scotland to police those incidents, but there is work underway that is making progress. But obviously, you know, this is a very big issue to address.
Do you feel... Sorry, I beg your pardon. Bring in Alistair.
I just wanted to add that you know, we recognise, you know, through the performance data that we received, that there is a significant work debt to officers. It was highlighted. You know, time off and lieu balance is standing at the moment at over 25,000 hours. The re-rostered rest days stand at over 28,000. So that time off, that decompression time that officers require when they're dealing with, you know, challenging and difficult job is not there to the level that we would hope. We focused on this on many occasions within the People Committee. We see other stressors there. A question earlier was about, you know, overtime. Overtime cost is up 12% on last year. These are all indicators of that stress that the workforce are under. We have, or Police Scotland have, a lot of support mechanisms in place, you know, to look after the welfare of the staff. But when we take that down to asking staff themselves, and you're asking them, you know, in staff surveys, are you getting enough time to recuperate? The answer is no. For a significant proportion of them, is your workload manageable? The answer is no. From a significant number of staff. So these are things that we are looking at. These are areas that we are challenging back to Police Scotland, and it's part of the reason why the Chief Constable has come forward with the ask that she has in terms of the increase in numbers.
Yeah, thank you. And that's very well set out in terms of workforce pressures in the Police Scotland submission, some of the detail around work debt as they describe it. And I think we've always accepted that there's been quite a significant demand on police time, but it feels as though it's becoming ever more acute. So I am pleased to see that that is a priority that the Chief Constable is focused on. So thank you for that. We are a little bit ahead of time, so I don't know if any other members want to come in with any final questions. No? In that case, then, I think we will wind up this session. And thank you very much for your time. That's been very helpful. And that concludes the first part, public part of our meeting, and we'll now move into private session. Thank you.